Before we get going too far into this, I do want to just give a quick round of applause to anybody who was involved in organizing this. A lot of you are here just as sort of customers and learners, but there were some people in the room. If you could stand up, if you had a role in organizing this conference, please stand up. I know gentlemen in front can stand up. Anybody else? Myself and Mike are part of the team that puts together the annual Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Convention in Stevens Point, and we know that it's sometimes a thankless task, that it's a task that takes time out of your calendar, and up here I think it's been a lot of volunteers who really make this happen, so thank you to the volunteers. I also want to give credit to anybody who's doing an exhibit outside in the entry area there. We have a number of different learning or different resources for you. I want to give a special shout out to Wisconsin's Green Fire. Stop by, I think they have a display out there, but they're also recruiting people to participate in a program that they have coming up at the end of August as well as in September, both in Vilas and Oneida County, where they're going to help sort of navigate some of the challenging there's an overwhelming amount of information about water resources out there, and the challenge for a lot of lake groups and property owners is to make meaning of that data. It doesn't obviously just sort of speak to itself. And I also want to give credit to the people who came here today, obviously all of you, thank you. Without you being here, these events don't have a lot of purpose. I want to ask a quick question to see, this is sort of, I brought along a couple of prizes to give out to folks. I want to know who believes, and we're not going to do a hard test on this, but who believes they traveled the furthest to get here today? Who came from fairly far away? So I've got a hand over here and a hand over here. So where did you come from up there in the corner?
Milwaukee.
We got Milwaukee and the woman in the blue?
Southwestern Iowa.
Southwestern Iowa. Mike, who also came from Iowa, believe it or not, he'll get that up.
Eastern. No.
I'm a long ways from home. So sorry.
And then sort of the flip side, it's fun navigating into this building when you kind of get into the driveways and stuff, but who believes they got here from the closest location? Who basically lives right on this place? So I got two hands here. I got Tom. How far did you have to go to get here?
Probably a mile and a half.
Mile and a half? How are we doing up here? Is it closer?
Not closer. Argonne Lumber is behind the county shop in Renner.
The county
Triggs.
Okay, Triggs versus the county shop, you said?
Yeah.
I'm not from Oneida County. I'm not from. Okay, so the county shop gets a can koozie. So I'm going to assume you didn't bring a pack of pointers with you, but if you did, you could use the can koozie to get you home. Briefly about the Lakes Partnership too, and about a lot of the backbone support for this program. When you hear the word Extension Lakes, or you hear about the DNR Lakes grants, do you think the average person knows how these programs are funded, where the money comes from to make this thing happen? Does anyone want to take a stab at guessing? Mike's going to give some updates on the budget process, but the legislature and the governor just wrapped up a 2-year budget process. If you dug into the budget, where do you think you'd find the money for there's about $6.5 million a year, every year, that goes out for grants to take care of aquatic plants and manage your lake. There's a couple $1 million worth of staff people at the DNR. So taxes, yes, definitely, because it's government money. Did you say fuel tax? That's correct, it's the fuel tax. Why would we use gas tax money to pay for lakes? Boats, specifically motorboats, right? So the state of Wisconsin, since the early 1980s, has recognized that motorboats pay the gas tax, right? There's not a lot of ways you can get around it. Most people still have to pay that tax when they fill up a gas can or they fill up their boat. And that money shouldn't be spent on potholes and bridges, but instead could be spent on the resource itself that the boaters are using, whether they're anglers or whether they're recreationists. If we can take care of these lakes, the way, when you fill up your truck or your car, the gas tax goes right back into those roads. It's the same logic. And actually, the logic applies to ATVs and snowmobiles. When you fill up your snowmobile, your ATV, the state of Wisconsin knows, based on registrations, roughly how much money is being generated by those watercraft. So we're extremely lucky. Other states actually don't use this same formula. Other states have the same basis. They could do this if they want to, but the state of Wisconsin is unique, I think, in basically redirecting the state collected gas tax into this program. So when you talk to your lawmakers and talk to other people in government, recognize that this is basically user fees. It's not out of your income tax or your sales tax. So for those of you, I just joined the motorboat owning population a couple of years ago. Thank you to everybody who does own and register a motorboat. We're going to now go into the program. You see basically everyone hopefully has an agenda, and you also hopefully have a list of biographies. Mike Engelson and myself kind of go back quite a ways. Mike is a graduate of our Lake Leader program with the Lakes Partnership, and he's been working at Wisconsin Lakes back when it was still called Wisconsin Association of Lakes. And he's the executive director. He's sort of our eyes on the street when it comes to things happening in Madison policy-wise, and he's here to give us a quick policy picture update. Please join me in giving a warm Wisconsin welcome to Mike Engelson.
All right, well, good morning, everybody, and I'm happy to be back up here in the Northwoods again for another year. Always look forward to this event, and thanks for the great turnout and for being willing to sit through some wonky political talk first thing in the morning. Oftentimes I get these talks at these things, I end up after lunch, which seems like the worst time to do wonky political talk, but as Eric said, I'm Mike Engelson. I'm with Wisconsin Lakes. We're the statewide nonprofit conservation organization and the Association of Lake Organizations in the state. We've been around for about 30 years. If you don't know us, you can see all the things that we do. We are an advocacy organization, so as Eric said, I do work in the Capitol talking to legislators some, maybe not as much now as I have in the past, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case in a second. But we also offer, and we'll be offering this year, a set of trainings we call our Lakes in Action program. There will be a suite of online events as well as hopefully some in-person workshops and maybe one up here in the north at some point during the year, where we'll teach you about how to be a better advocate for your own organization and how your own organization can actually be an advocate as well. We often hear that there are problems in being able to talk to lawmakers, whether they're local or at the state level, if you don't live in that particular district, if you're not a constituent of that person. There's a lot that your lake organizations can do as advocates, even under the terms of your tax exemptions, without running into problems. And so the Lakes in Action program is kind of designed to help you learn what it is that you can do, become better advocates, and hopefully we end up with better water policy as a result. So, into the wonky stuff. I'll preface this by saying I've got quite a few slides, and I doubt I will actually be able to get through them all because I talk a lot. But there really is not a ton of stuff going on within the realm of water policy at the legislative level, as has been the case really since we had a Democratic governor elected and retained a Republican-led legislature. There have been other issues, among them a pandemic that sort of intervened, that had changed the types of things that the legislator was looking at, but also there's the knowledge on the part that likely a lot of wholesale changes that move us away from strong water policy, in my opinion. So an example of that would be the change to the shoreline zoning programs back in 2015. Those kind of things are not going to those bills are not going to get signed or be very likely to be signed by this governor. So there just has not been a whole lot of action. But as Eric alluded to, it's a budget year, so there are some interesting things that I think we can learn from that budget process, maybe in thinking about how we approach getting legislation and getting funding for things moved along in the future. So I'm going to spend less time talking about specific bills and a little more time talking about some kind of mechanics of things that hopefully will be instructive and interesting. I always think it's best to start out with sort of a grounding as to where we are in the legislative cycle. So the Wisconsin legislature meets 2 years, and it starts in the odd number year following the election in the fall of the even number year. So we had an election in November of 2022, and in January of 2023, this legislature sits. The state budget then runs in 2-year cycles, and it's passed. The state fiscal year ends on June 30th, so assuming this clicker works, yep. The last budget ended on June 30th, so the goal at least was for the legislature to have a budget passed and signed by the governor by July 1st. They were a little bit late. Wisconsin's not like the federal government where if that happens, everything shuts down. We just keep going with the current budget until the new one is passed. I think there have been times a couple decades ago where budgets have gone well into the fall before they were passed. But we're right about here. And one of the important takeaways of this is that most of the legislative work that happens in this first part of the 2-year legislative cycle or biennium is on the budget. There is not as much general legislation that's worked on here. It's really they take a break now for summer to go back and speak with constituents. There's some committee work that goes on in the summer. But most of the bills that get passed in a session, that happens in the fall, starting around November. And it'll run until through at least March of 2024. There have been a couple of years where the assembly has ended in as early as February. Speaker Boss likes to get things finished a little more quickly than some legislative leaders have. Sometimes it'll go all the way into May. Then they break in the even-numbered year in the summer to let everybody campaign. And there's a lame duck session after the November elections where there might be some activity that goes on, but not a whole lot. So we have just finished the budget, so we're going to get into the budget. That's just to indicate that sometimes it goes on for a while. Budget is introduced by the governor in February. This year, as it has been the case since we had, and as is, I think, often the case when we have split parties in the governor's office and controlling the legislature, the governor's budget was largely, I would say, ignored by the Joint Committee on Finance, which is the committee of the legislature that puts together the actual budget document that then gets voted on. So they took a few things from what the governor proposed, but mostly just sort of started over from scratch. And procedurally, there's a bunch of, they have a bunch of hearings where there are motions on particular issues. So there's a day where they work on the agriculture section of the budget. There's a day where they work on natural resources, which is most of the funding for DNR and resource agencies. And those get passed and become the actual bill. So the governor asked for some money for PFAS mitigation. PFAS are the recently becoming more aware of chemicals that last for a very, very long time, if not forever in the environment, that we're seeing a lot more contamination from and are becoming a significant problem or have been a significant problem that we're just recognizing. The governor asked for money to increase funding to county conservationists, for lead lateral replacements. There was some money in there for a wild rice program as well. Not a lot of that actually ended up in the final bill. So there was, the legislature did put in $125 million for funding some work on PFAS, but there was nothing in the budget bill that said how that money could be spent. Put a pin on that because we're going to come back to it because that's one of the first interesting technical pieces that I think we should be aware of. But there was funding put in the bill for that. There was funding for county conservationists, but it actually ended up being a slight reduction instead of an increase in funding. So every county can ask the state for funding for up to, and it's staggered, there's partial funding, I won't go into the whole scheme of it because I don't have time, but for up to 3 staff positions in county conservation departments. They have been historically underfunded. We are always asking for more money because, as all of you know, we've got some county conservationists here. the roles they play are very important in managing the natural resources in the counties. And either due to a decision on the way that the money would be allocated, or it actually seems quite possibly because of a drafting error, a math a problem in adding numbers up correctly, there was not the proper amount to keep everyone funded at the same level. It's not a huge cut, but some counties will see some reduction in funding in county conservationists. There was also a one-time increase in the amount given to producer-led council grants. Producer-led councils are groups of farmers that get together and work usually on regenerative or sustainable agriculture ideas. The first point I want to make from both of those bottom two is that the increases in both cases that were proposed were to what's called the base budget. So the base budget is basically what is the sort of norm number that is used to determine what the next budget would be. So I'm making this number up, but I think that the initial grant to producer-led councils was either 250 or 500,000. So let's say that the next time you go through the budget, if the amount last time was 500, then the base amount would be 500. What the legislature has tended to do lately is, instead of increasing the base to keep up with inflation or other increasing costs, is do these one-time increases each budget. One of the problems with that is then there's inconsistency in, sometimes you get errors like we did potentially with the county conservationists, but there's also not as much stability. The people that give out the producer-led council grants don't really know from one budget to the next whether they're likely to get the same amount again, because the amount that sort of like the beginning consideration goes back to $500,000. So, and this has been going on for a while, and so one of the things that I think we need to start like really advocating for is increases, not just on a one-time, on a per budget basis, but some of these costs have to go up on the base. There was no money given for wild rice restoration and public education about rice. There was no funding provided in this biennium for what we call our basin educators. They're paid for out of a fund that deals with polluted runoff, but they're usually extension agents that work on various issues around the state. There was a proposal that all the fees from the aquatic plant management program, so the permitting fees for APM, would actually go to the APM program. That was not included in the budget that Joint Finance put through. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about this shared revenue making land protection harder bill. It was so when bills are proposed, if they're in the Assembly, they're called AB for Assembly Bill and SB for Senate Bill. This was actually signed by the governor, so it's Act 12, and it has some provisions. So shared revenue is the amount of money that is given to communities by the state, basically to help fund the city operations. So this bill was part of a years-long negotiation between the legislature and the governor's office on how to handle financing problems mostly with Milwaukee. So there was a lot of stuff in this bill about Milwaukee, but there were a handful of things that had nothing to do with shared revenue. One of which, it said that any land purchase or easement purchase through the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Fund that was going to take place north of Highway 8 now has to be approved by every local municipality that has land that would be implicated by that purchase. So if you have a small piece of land that is in 3 different towns and you've proposed to the state that to put a conservation easement on it, it would have to be approved by all 3 towns, which is a much harder hurdle than the previous procedure, which was the towns and the county and the other municipalities could provide feedback to DNR, but ultimately it was DNR's decision whether or not to go ahead with that purchase. The other piece is that it is now prohibited for counties, cities, other local municipalities to hold advisory referendums so unless it's something related to funding within that locality. So the River Alliance of Wisconsin over the last few years has done some, they call them their clean water referenda, where it's basically just a question of, do you support clean water? It's advisory, carries no actual force of law or anything like that, but those kind of referenda are no longer allowed under this particular law. One of the things that you see that often happens in legislation is you have these kind of pieces that are relatively small, relatively niche, have nothing to do with the very large piece of important stuff, this shared revenue thing and how Milwaukee is going to be able to operate. These little pieces get stuck in legislation, and then you have, this was part of a long negotiated agreement, like I said, between the governor and the legislature. He didn't really have much choice once the decision has been made to sign the bill, even if he doesn't particularly agree with these sorts of things. So, in general, that's true, except in the case of the budget. So in Wisconsin, the governor has a very unique power. I don't think there are very many states that have this, where he or she can line out particular lines of the budget. It's called the line item veto. It was authorized by state constitutional amendment, so it passed the legislature twice and was voted on by all of us. It actually used to be a letter item veto, so they used to be able to line out particular letters, but you can really change the way legislation, the budget works by doing this. It's only allowed for bills that have fiscal pieces, so that's why it's mostly used with the budget. The biggest example that it was used this year, it changed the way that the school funding formula was done, so that instead of just being a one-time increase, it was actually an increase that would run through I think it was 24, 25 or something like that. I haven't actually looked at the bill to find out how they crafted that. It had to have been like a pretty artistic use of the strike through. But, and that actually, you read that, you hear that, and you think, oh, that's funny, 24, 25, that's, things will change before then. I think what actually happened there was this was a way that the governor saw that he could use the line item veto to increase the base. So, obviously in 24, 25, we don't even know what Wisconsin's gonna look like. But in the immediate future, the number that will have to be used to decide whether those funds go up or down will be basically this new base that was created through this line item veto. Now you can argue whether that's actually a good thing that governors have that power, and I think that's actually a pretty good question to ask. But in this case, I think that's a way that the governor was able to get around not having that increase in base, and I think that's something that we can look at in the future. Sort of the flip side of the line item veto thing, it comes out in this bill AB 312, SB 312. That happens very rarely that they have the same number. It just happened that they intersected at the right time in terms of when the bill was introduced in the Assembly and the Senate. But this bill basically spells out how that $125 million in the budget for PFAS will be spent. Can anybody think why the legislature would put the instructions of how the money would be spent in a bill that's not in the budget bill, based on what I just talked about?
So nobody will notice it.
So maybe. That certainly is potential that it sort of bifurcates it and it makes it, but it also, by separating it, it might make it a little more visible. But what it does is it prevents the governor from using a line item veto. So if in the budget it says we'll give you $125 million, but it has to be spent on A, B, C, and can't be spent on D, E, and F. If it's in the budget, a governor could line out D, E, and F. This way, it's not an appropriation. There's not money being designated to be spent. It's just explaining how money that was already appropriated could be spent. So there probably is not an opportunity for a line item veto. Honestly, I don't think I've ever seen that process used before. It's pretty clever, to say the least. I think we probably will see it used again in other legislation. But it's something that we need to think about when we're proposing and talking about getting things funded. That, you know, is it something that we're likely to want? There might be the possibility that something a part of it needs to be lined out or not, and be aware that a bill like this does exist, that you might hear in the press there was funding for PFAS, but there might be another bill, to your point, that you don't hear about as much, that explains how it's being spent. We are neutral on this bill because it's still being crafted. There was a lot of legalese in it that a lot of people on both sides of the issue were not comfortable with. So we're still kind of waiting to see what the final bill shakes out as. As a lakes organization, PFAS is more probably of a ground and a drinking water issue, so I don't spend a lot of time on that issue anyway. It's certainly becoming more relevant within the surface water community as well, but most of the spending in the bill relates to programs that relate to drinking and groundwater, so I don't spend a lot of time on it. And speaking of time,
You got 1 minute.
1 minute? All right. Those were the points that I really wanted to bring out. I think, will they have an opportunity to get the slides? Yeah, so you can, if you have questions on the other bills or things that I have in my slides, feel free to reach out to me and I can talk to you about them. And I don't know if we're taking questions, but.
What we'll do is we have time at the very end of 11:30 to do a lot of questions for anybody who presents today. So we'll hold questions until then, and let's just thank Mike for sharing this update. Like to keep the show on time as much as possible, but as you can see on the agenda, we save time at 11:30 for attendee comments and questions, and that's really meant to address both the panel that we'll have at the second part of the morning, as well as the presenters that we have in the first part of the morning. I mentioned before the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership, and it's really a collaboration between the University of Wisconsin, most notably through Extension Lakes, but also the broader university is a part of this partnership. And I'm pleased to have Gretchen Garish here. She's the director now of the UW Center for Limnology at the Trout Lake Station. The Trout Lake Station, if you have not been to it, is a place worth at least checking out and getting to know a little bit. It's one of the longest running sort of field research stations related to lakes as a scientific endeavor. Limnology in some circles is recognized as having its roots really at Trout Lake and at UW-Madison, with researchers that started working on kind of solving lake dilemmas over 100 years ago. So we're pleased to have Gretchen Garish here as a director. You can read her biography on here as well. She's going to give us a quick update on some of the research projects that they have going on, particularly related to invasive species. So I'll turn it over to Gretchen, and I think I'll hand you the remote.
All right.
And I think you want to use here too for the mic.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity to come and meet with some of you today and to talk with you. Tom Ewing from Violence County gave the invite, and I'm really grateful to be here with all of you. The ask was to focus mostly on spiny water flea and zebra mussels and what's going on in our systems relative to these organisms. I'll preface my talk today by saying I'm not an invasive species specialist. What I do really focus on is plankton and all those microscopic tiny organisms that are in your lakes that make up a huge component of the food web. They're really important. Some people think of them as fish food, but I think of them as residents of the lake that drive a lot of dynamics, including your clear water, water chemistry, and yeah, they provide fish food. But so the groups we're going to talk about mostly today include the spiny water flea, which are pictured up top here. You blow those up 100 times the size, and they would be a terrifying beast running around your environments. And they are, in lakes, they're predators, so they eat other zooplankton. They also serve as food for fishes, and when they come into the lake, can really change dynamics. So we'll focus on that a little bit. And the other is zebra mussels. And a lot of folks think of zebra mussels as these resident mollusks that encrust every hard surface that they can find. But they're also a major resident in the plankton. And so this image over on the right there is a picture of a veliger larvae of a zebra mussel. And so hundreds of thousands of these can float around in the water column. They run around in the water column filtering algae. And so that's a high resolution microscope. You can actually see the shell starting to form and this little ciliated band coming out while they're swimming around in the water column. But the middle picture there is what they actually look like under the microscope, which is lots of little dots with these feathered tips. So where did they come from and where are they? Spiny water flea came to the Great Lakes through ballast water, and they arrived in about 1984 was the first time they were detected in Lake Huron. They traveled over from Russia and European waters as well as some northern Asian waters. And ballast water, many of you have probably heard of that. This is a reservoir of water that cargo ships and other large container ships take on board. As they go into the ocean, they need that weight so that they sink in that buoyant condition. And then as they enter into the freshwater Great Lakes system, they have to eject that water in order to maintain a buoyancy balance. And so they came into Lake Huron. Again, the estimate, the first detection was around 1984. And then by 1987, they were found in Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. And so while they came in through the Great Lakes, they've also been taking some stair steps to get into some of the flowing waters and the lakes of the Great Lakes region. Zebra mussels took a similar path. They came from more European-centric waters, and then they came in through the Great Lakes, and as you can see in this map, they're pretty good travelers. Those little veliger larvae like to move along water corridors, flowing water corridors, and can take residence in both kind of backwaters of river systems as well as lakes. And while they are found throughout the Great Lakes region, this is the map blown up of Wisconsin, and what you see is quite a few zebra mussel colonizations on the eastern portion of the state. But here in the northern region of Wisconsin, we don't see a ton of populations in the lakes in the area. So I'm going to talk about why these invaders are so good at what they do. And so some organisms have life histories or life cycles that make them especially adapted to dispersing between systems and to really taking residence once they arrive in those systems. And spiny water flea and zebra mussels are just a couple of examples of some of the invasive natured creatures that when they get into a system can really proliferate. So spiny water flea are a close cousin to the common water flea, which we also call Daphnia, and their life cycle is relatively similar. And so I couldn't find a spiny water flea life cycle, but I was just going to use the basic one to think about why they can really take hold very quickly. And it's because they reproduce in a cool way. It's called cyclic parthenogenesis, but basically it's the alternation between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And so one Daphnia coming in, a female, reproduces asexually and she makes a whole bunch of clonal babies. And so she's able to do this without without finding partners, so it's just one individual can come into the system. In the common water flea, they can actually produce up to 100 eggs for some of the biggest species. The spiny water flea, the estimate is that they can produce about 10 offspring in a 2-week period. And so one spiny water flea moving from one water body to the next, becoming resident in that habitat, having food, can produce 10 offspring every 2 weeks, and they can do this over and over again. And then all of those offspring can mature and also produce offspring repeatedly. And so this asexual reproduction allows for what we call exponential population growth. That means like a multiplier by 10 every single 2 weeks. So I just did this little math exercise over on the right. This graph represents that one invader could reach 1 million individuals in just a 3-month period at that rate. One invader. So this is why a simple dispersal of a very few individuals can actually have a big impact. The other thing that this life cycle allows, so asexual reproduction is kind of the default. They reproduce asexually when they have good food, when there's plenty of water around, not too much predation. But if these populations get stressed, so if spiny water flea don't have enough food available, temperature environments get tough, or too much predation. Just like the common water flea, they'll produce they'll switch to sexual reproduction, and so that female will produce genetically identical male offspring, and then we get fertilization and genetic recombination. But the result of sexual reproduction is a sexual egg, and this egg is often encased in a special case, and it's resistant to drying, freezing, passage of guts of fishes and birds, all of these conditions. This is a means of dispersing both in time as well as in space. And the reproduction of this egg, you can see here, so this is a spiny water flea egg, and you can kind of see the spicules, or the tail spine of that water flea here. So these are the spines of the spiny water flea and the dormant eggs of those water fleas. And this is actually a fecal pellet of a fish with those spiny water flea eggs that have broken off and are passing through the gut of that fish successfully. So these dormant eggs have a lot of dispersal capabilities, right? Like I said, they can pass through fish guts. Folks have found Daphnia eggs in the skin of frogs, like in that slimy layer on the outside. And some of them can live a really long time. The spiny water flea egg, we don't have as much data on how long it can survive, but other groups like the Daphnia or common water fleas, those eggs have been hatched over 100 to 200 years old. So these eggs can last a long time in sediments and in water columns. The other thing is they can reach incredibly high densities. In the Great Lakes in Lake Michigan, they've actually estimated that during a single year, the spiny water flea can produce eggs that would be at a density of about 400 per meter squared. It's a lot of eggs. If you think about this podium would have hundreds of eggs just laying on the surface here. So that makes them very effective at moving between habitats and having low numbers kind of established. And so the other thing that they have are these spines. And so the spines are really good to prevent them from getting eaten by fish, but they also are a good dispersal mechanism. If any of you have fished in spiny water flea waters or tried to pull a rope up in the Lake Michigan, these hooks and barbs actually do a good job of grabbing onto surfaces, which allows them to grab onto those and then move between habitats. The other thing is the eggs will often be bound up in the skeleton of these things and the spines, and so the spines kind of pull off and will take the eggs with them to move them between habitats. So the zebra mussel also has a life cycle that allows for dispersal. We already talked a little bit about that larval stage. So here's they are sexual reproducing. So males and females produce egg and sperm, and then they give rise to this larval stage that goes up in the water column. And that larval stage can settle down and attach to surfaces after just about 5 days. But it can also stay, if it doesn't find suitable habitat, it can stay in the water column for up to 5 weeks and move around and get to different places. One of the really effective things is that these guys just put tons of larvae and gametes out into the water column. They estimate that females can produce 1.6 million eggs per year. That's a lot of offspring to be dispersed through waters. And they can also reach incredibly high densities. In the Great Lakes, they've measured up to 700,000 individuals per square meter. Again, I think about this little podium here and how many of these, and each one producing 1.6 million offspring. And so they can grow relatively quickly. They have those strong byssal threads that allow them to attach onto surfaces and move on the bottom of boats or other surfaces between systems. So the life cycles of these two species in particular that we're talking about today really do help facilitate the movement. And this is true of many of the other species that we consider invasive or moving quickly and taking high residence, is that they have something in their life cycle or life history that allows them to succeed with those strategies. So I just wanted to put this in here first, and then we'll talk a little bit about the ecological consequences of this. But when you think about the suggested mitigation for invasive species, many of you are very familiar with this, participating in clean boats and clean waters and how to help prevent the movements, it does take on a different meaning when you actually know the life cycle and why we do it. So I think of don't move water between systems. When you think of one individual moving around, or the fact that these eggs are teeny tiny and almost invisible to the human eye, it's really kind of logical that moving water between systems, you might not notice that one of these creatures is moving with you. Sediments or sand between systems. Although we think of these as aquatic, pelagic, floating organisms, the dormant stages of these that can survive drying and freezing take residence in sand and sediments, and so the movement of even those materials between systems, they would definitely need dried out or treated so that you're not carrying the eggs and these really resistant dormant stages of the water flee between systems. And then the boats, high heat power wash has been a demonstrated way of killing the eggs and making sure that they are not resident on the surface of things moving between systems. Bleach solution of about 500 parts per million has also been seen as effective. And then another is to dry the boats for up to 5 days between when you're moving from maybe a water body to another. Bait buckets are another mechanism. I just showed a fish gut where those eggs are sitting in the stomach of the fishes. And so even thinking about where you get your bait and maybe let them have a gut clear before you put them into a system. Those are some of the strategies. You know, if you let your fish sit for 24 hours before you go fishing with them, that anything that was in there will pass through and you wouldn't be carrying these little eggs around. And then also making sure that when we gut fish or when we process fish, we're doing it in the lake we caught them from or on land, so that you're not taking them to a new lake or a new dock to add that potential source into the waterways. So what if they do get around? These invasive species do change the food webs of our lakes. And we've seen this especially in some of the eutrophic lakes that are down in the southern part of the state. I think with the more recent invasions in this region, we still have a lot to learn. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about Lake Mendota, which has both spiny water flea as well as zebra mussels, and it's one that researchers at the Center for Limnology have worked on kind of extensively. And so spiny water flea, this is a kind of a lake food web over there. You can see on the bottom we've got the algae or the phytoplankton. And then we've got a bunch of small zooplankton. These are all the creatures that I look at under the microscope regularly. A huge diversity of organisms that live there, including the common water flea or the small herbivorous Cladocera. And then we do have some predators that are invertebrates. And so the spiny water flea, we've got a couple of midge larvae. This Leptodora looks like a crazy dragon that floats around in the water column. Some other copepods. And so that middle level are crustaceans that eat crustaceans and rotifers. And then we have our planktivorous fish, things that are going to eat all of those plankton down below, and then our piscivorous fish. So when spiny water flea comes in, they are major consumers of the plankton in our lakes. They are also prey for small fish. We see lots and lots of spiny water flea in the stomachs of cisco and smelt and perch and minnows. They can cause some lesions in the guts of some of the smaller minnow-type fish, but they seem to do okay in some of the other stomachs, like the perch. And then the other thing that they can do is actually alter behavior. So in ecology, we often think about direct versus indirect effects of these events or of an invasion. And so some of the direct effects of the spiny water flea are just what they consume. And so they're microscopic crustaceans, but when we're talking about millions of them in a system, they actually can consume just as much biomass as some of our fishes. And so the estimates in Lake Huron, for example, is that they are eating about 70% of the other plankton, and that transferring the trophic food web at that level. And that is all a change from planktivorous fish, which used to make up that 70%. And so this graph is from Lake Mendota. It's from a paper published by Jake Walsh in 2017. And it has 3 of the major players over time in that system. So Cisco were in that system up until 1987. And then the dotted line, you see that the Cisco were eating a bunch of zooplankton. So this is the planktivory, or the amount of plankton being eaten. And so you can see that Cisco were major clears in the spring and in the fall. And then the Cisco were lost from the system. So from 88 to 2015, things like perch and bluegill and whitefish were in that lake, and they were consuming the plankton. But then from 09 to 15, the spiny water flea invaded during that time. And what you can see is that they were eating about as much plankton as the other fishes were during those periods of time. They've become the dominant planktivore in that system. And in the next figure, I'll talk about what that's done to water clarity and other populations within the lake. The other thing to note about spiny water flea is they're good predators, but they definitely target the slower moving, bigger bodied species of zooplankton. That might not seem to matter, but this big juicy Daphnia over here is called Daphnia pulicaria, and they're really good, effective algal eaters. And so they clear the water, they turn over a lot of nutrients and are a favorite food of fishes. And so when spiny water flea are present, they'll eat all of this species, leaving this kind of pointy, small-bodied other species of Daphnia called Daphnia mendota. So they change the species composition of the plankton in addition to just reducing the biomass. So by preferentially eating certain species, they can change the lake conditions across the food web. So here's from that same study by Welsh et al. Through 1987, the Cisco were a prominent planktivore in the lake. They would eat lots of Daphnia along with the other planktivorous fish. Lots of Daphnia were being eaten. And those Daphnia, with the numbers being down, Lake Mendota would be green, lots of algae, not enough plankton to kind of clear that water. If you've ever been down to Madison, you might recognize that Mendota is pretty green at times. And so really poor water clarity. Well, in 1987, the Cisco were lost from the lake, and there was a manipulation done to add a bunch of larger piscivorous fish. This drove down the number of our planktivorous fish. So all of a sudden, the perch and the whitefish, the other fishes in the lake, declined in number. And so there was not a lot of pressure on the plankton. You had tons of Daphnia, and you would get these big phases of clear water. And this was seen as a great thing for the shorelines of Madison and other places, and the water clarity, or our Secchi depth, increased pretty dramatically during this stretch. When spiny water flea invaded, they actually filled that space that the other planktivorous fish had, so the spiny water flea came in, and they again flipped this dynamic. And so since the spiny water flea invasion, the water in Lake Mendota is much less clear, so that algae has become prevalent, and there's really a change in that whole ecosystem dynamic with the invasion of the spiny water flea. So the other thing that we think of in terms of indirect effects is behavioral. And so one of the impacts that we see in spiny water flea, zooplankton have a regular behavior called diel vertical migration. It's kind of logical. During the daytime, they go down deep to hide from predators. But at night, when those predators can't see as well, the zooplankton will come up into the surface waters and feed on all the algae that's grown through the day. It's kind of a regular exchange that happens in many of our lakes up here. When spiny water flea come in, they're not quite as dependent on visual predation, and so they will prey throughout the water column. And so because of that, they'll actually move up into the water column at night also, because they don't want to get eaten by fish. And so moving up into the water column, they limit the ability of all of these zooplankton to come up there and to consume the algae that's up in those surface waters. They actually force the zooplankton down in the water column, and this changes both the trophic transfer, so the amount of energy going into the plankton and then into the fishes, and also the way that the fishes can encounter and forage the plankton in our systems. These are the types of indirect effects that are really hard to measure, right? We can look at a whole lake and say, how is the spiny water flea maybe influencing fish or influencing algal production, but why is it happening? And I think there's still a lot of questions on how it's driving the behaviors of both fishes and plankton within our systems. So it's very evident that spiny water flea, when they come into a lake, often will outcompete some of the fish species. So pelagic fishes like perch will come out and feed in the pelagic on zooplankton. What happens when spiny water flea invade is that they outcompete those perch in the open water, and many perch will move into the littoral and focus foraging on benthic insects, hang out and eat the plankton that's in that littoral region. And so there's been good evidence in the Canadian Shield Lakes that when spinies invade, the perch seem to move into more littoral habitats, again, changing that food web dynamic and the system pretty substantially, and the foraging of our large piscivorous fishes. And the other thing is that they can eat all the good plankton, leaving poor growth for some of the fish species in particular. Direct effects of zebra mussels, again, a lot of this comes from the Great Lakes. And I think one of the numbers that astounded me is that the zebra mussels in Lake Michigan are capable of filtering the entire volume of Lake Michigan in 4 to 6 days. When I say filter, that means that they suck the water in, they take in the phytoplankton, and then they put kind of cleared water back out. And so this picture of Lake Michigan of clear water and the little fish hanging out in there is really a big change, right? Instead of all of that planktonic dynamic happening in the pelagic, now what's happening is those nutrients are being captured into the benthos, the bottom of the lake, which really changes that food web dynamic. And so the loss of algae or phytoplankton in the water column limits the amount of trophic transfer or energy transfer out there, but it also creates more light, allows more light to hit to the benthos. You get more macrophytes and some of this, gummy filamentous algae that grows on the rocks. And then the fish will move into the shallows where there's more insects and prey available. They also have more shelter. And with the loss of the salmon fishery in the Great Lakes, it's estimated that the invasion of zebra mussels into that system has led to billions of dollars of economic loss in the fisheries harvest from the Great Lakes. So, I'm doing all right on time? Yeah.
6 minutes.
All right, perfect. So what are we looking at in our area? Well, I think we're looking at newer invasions, right? 1980s was some of the earliest ones. Spiny water flea are present in the Great Lakes, and they've spread to some of our lakes. Been documented on the USGS website, and from discussions include Trout Lake, Plum Lake, Ike Walden Lake, Stormy Lake, and Star Lakes in Vilas County. Stormy Lake was one of the initial invasions in the area, with Trout Lake happening after that. They're also present in the Guile flowage and in Iron County. And so they have, a lot of folks think of them as deep and cold water lake species, but we have seen them in some of the shallower, warmer and flowing systems. So a little less predictable. What are their impacts? I think we're still learning. We do know that most of the information I provided are from some deeper and more productive, like eutrophic lakes in Canada and then in southern Wisconsin. And so a lot of the information I provided today were from systems like that. We don't have as much evidence on what they're going to do here. In some of those systems, we've seen that the numbers aren't reaching as high of densities as they are in the more productive systems. But we think that the potential impacts could be considerable given what we know from the lakes that have had them for longer. So what are we looking at for zebra mussels? They're kind of all around, so I zoomed in on Wisconsin here, and they're kind of all around, but here in the northern portion of Wisconsin, we don't see as many zebra mussels moving in. A lot of discussion has been had that they're probably getting here, and that maybe it's the pH conditions and the calcium needs of these mollusks that's not allowing them to take hold. So we don't know for sure if zebra mussels will be able to succeed if they get here, or how, as water bodies change, things may happen. But prevention, so here's some of the key elements. Prevention is one of the first steps, and I think all of you are, many of you are actively engaged with working on prevention. The Clean Boats and Clean Waters Act is a good, effort is a good example of that. But really education and decision making about access to lakes and how lakes are used is a really key element to this, and keeping an active voice in your local governments, engaging stakeholders. These are all really important prevention mechanisms. As I said, these things are microscopic. It's not an easy thing to keep tiny invaders out, and once they're there, they're almost impossible to get rid of. So that's why we do early detection, work on monitoring, and then supporting research. And then also realize that it takes some adaptive thinking about these. So it's great to resist, but if they get there, what is the plan and how do we adapt to their present, and what direction do we want to head if they do arrive, and are there ways to manage for it? And so I think it's great to have so many managers engaged in trying to be aware and think forward on how this can be addressed. So with that, I'll put in a plug. If you want to learn more about this and other research that's going on at Trout Lake Station, we welcome everybody from the community to come and join us on August 4th for our open house at the station. All of our students will be out. They'll have their displays out, everything from rusty crayfish to wild rice to Cisco research on display, and there's free Babcock ice cream. So, yeah, so come join us.
And again, Gretchen will be sticking around to take your questions later on too, before the noon break. But thank you, Gretchen. And again, just amazing that we have this research firepower right in your backyard. It's not everywhere in the upper Midwest that you'd have such a great field station and people coming up from Madison on a regular basis doing this type of research. Next, we're going to transition from very, very small things to some really big things. Loons, you all are very fortunate up here in the Northwoods. I live down in Stevens Point in Portage County. We only have a handful of lakes that can sustain loons throughout the year, so it's rare that we get to see and hear them. Up here, you're all fortunate, but you also have some challenges related to loons, so I think we're going to hear some of those challenges from Mark Naniet. He's the Director of Rehabilitation with Wild Instincts. You might have met with him out in the foyer this morning. But he's going to talk about specifically lead poisoning and some of the challenges that lead presents to our loons. So let's give a welcome to Mark.
Good morning. Thank you for having us today. So half hour isn't a whole lot of time to talk about lead poisoning, but we'll kind of touch on it a little bit. So we're a wildlife rehabilitation facility. We're not for profit, which makes it a little bit more difficult than some of the state organizations because we don't get funding from state, federal, county, anything like that. So not only do we have to care for the animals, we have to figure out ways to fundraise as well. So we face a lot of challenges. We take care of about 1,300 animals per year on average, and average about 125 different species. So we don't do just loons, we do many different things. And of course, in the course of wildlife rehabilitation, we see a lot of different things, a lot of different challenges that face us, as the years go on. Year 2000, all of a sudden West Nile virus arrived. And so we had to adapt and change and saw a lot of different things that happened with that. Avian influenza, and of course we're still dealing with that right now to some degree. And of course our good friend COVID, that's changed a lot of what we do. So a lot of the animals are susceptible to COVID, so we have to do hazmat suits and gloves and gowns and everything like that. And so it's changed a lot of what we do. So as wildlife rehabbers, we have to be constantly adapting to different things. And one of the things that's been a constant in the 27 years that we've been here is lead poisoning. And so we see that very commonly in loons, eagles, swans. That's probably our three most common species that we see it in, but it's something that we deal with on almost a daily basis. So we deal with probably about 50 to 60 eagles per year, bald eagles, and the percentage some years is as high as 98%. And so in the loon population, probably about 50%. And so every loon is tested when it comes in our doors to see if they haven't, ingested anything that contains a lead situation. Let's see if we can get this to click here.
Point at the computer behind you.
There we go. Okay, so some of the sources that we see from lead poisoning, a couple different things. Of course, lead ammunition. So that's, we're trying to get a lot of this stuff banned. Some states have already done it. California luckily did it. And that was one of the demise of the California condor. They're, animals that are scavengers. They feed on these animals that have been shot by hunters, and they pick up these lead particles. So that's one of the biggest things. We're trying to get people to switch over to non-lead ammunition. Fishing tackle, that's another thing. Most of your jig heads, sinkers, things like that are all made of lead. And so when you go into Walmart, you'll have a section, 2 aisles long of lead fishing equipment and maybe a 2 foot by 2 foot section of non-lead. And so the biggest thing is public education, making people aware of what we're doing to our environment here. And the lead is very bad for our system. What did we have years ago? Leaded gasoline. We took it out of our gasoline. We used to have leaded paints. We took the lead out of our paints as well because we realized that was causing troubles. And so there's been a lot of situations, where lead has caused a lot of issues for a lot of different things, people included. So back in the 80s, we took out lead ammunition for duck hunting over water areas. And so therefore, because all these shot pellets would rain down into lakes, rivers, streams, and be all these potential contaminants that ducks, geese, swans, other animals can pick up. And then of course it goes through the ecosystem. So if a duck or a goose picks up some lead pellets, now it's easy prey for an eagle because they get sick, then the eagle ingests it, maybe not necessarily the pellets, but the blood and the tissue, which contains high amounts of lead in a lot of cases, and so it goes right through the food chain. So in the case of loons, typically you say, well, how does a loon get it? Well, they can actually directly ingest a jig head, sinker, something like that, or if somebody catches a fish, the line breaks, and they had a lead jig head or sinker, and it's now in that fish. Maybe the fish gets a little impaired, is easy prey for the loon eats that, and the lead jig head or sinker is inside of it. We've had several x-rays where we've had as many as 5 or 6 lead jig heads or sinkers inside of a loon's body. So contamination from eating the prey is very bad as well. Plus we have polluted groundwater and plants. So from all the years of leaded gasoline, of course all that lead fumes and things like that would go down into our ditches and basically uptake by the plants. Deer would eat that, become a roadkill, eagles eat that, and lead goes through the system. So an animal gets lead poisoning, in the case of a loon, basically it's a situation where they ingest that. If it's a painted jig head, maybe they've got about 48 hours. If it's something that has paint chipped off of it, they've got about 24 hours. Once it starts mixing with the stomach acid, basically that goes through the bloodstream very, very quickly. And the problem with lead is it causes a lot of problems for the body, basically liver, kidneys, central nervous system. So there's far-ranging problems with lead poisoning. And get our beautiful bird that we just saw here a couple slides ago, and now this is what it's turned into. An animal that basically can't sit up, can't swim, can't eat any food, and is basically regurgitating some green, nasty stuff. And how are we going to get it out? So we have a chelating agent that we can use for injecting, but if you have the source in the stomach, basically loons eat a lot of rocks and different things like that to help kind of grind up their food in their proventriculus, their stomach. And so what happens is this lead kind of grates around with these rocks and continuously sheds particles along with the stomach acid digesting that. And so to get that out of there, basically you're looking at a surgery type situation, which loons are very, not very comfortable with that kind of situation. They're very wild animals. To try to cut them open and get that out of there, they're most likely going to die. Other methods that we've done, we actually put a tube all the way down in their stomach, put a trach tube in there so they have oxygen, and basically you just turn on a water faucet, hold them upside down, and try to flush that out of their system. There again, if they're extremely weak, like in the case of this one, they're probably not going to be able to handle being anesthetized. Just the anesthesia alone will be enough to kill them. And so it gets to be a very difficult situation when you get them, because they go from ground zero to 24 hours being highly, highly contaminated with lead. So it's a very quick process. And so it's a situation where the only other thing that we can do sometimes is we can do like an endoscopic procedure. We've done that before a couple years ago. Now we don't really have access to a machine anymore to be able to do that. And so they could actually go down endoscopically, grab that sinker or jig head, and then pull it back out again. And so we've done that in the past, but no longer have access to that kind of machine. Other than that, basically the stomach acids are going to continue to break that down. We can inject a chemical into the loon, which will kind of negate that to some degree, but unless you can get out the source of contamination, that could take 6 to 8 months for that to be digested, in which case the loon is sick, can't really eat, and so it's one that's basically not going to survive. So bald eagle is another one of our big ones that we see. So take our big national bird here, beautiful bird, and put all this green goo all over its head, make it sickly, having seizures, and not exactly what we want to do with our national symbol. It's a very easy solution to get rid of lead in our system, but unfortunately, we're facing a lot of negative people that don't want to switch over for whatever reason. So you can see this particular eagle, the slide in the bottom right there, ingested 4 shotgun pellets. So whether it ate a duck, grouse, rabbit, who knows what it might have eaten, but anyway, ingested those 4 shotgun pellets. And there again, now it's a matter of getting it out. And when they get sick like this, like I said, they can't eat, they can't really drink, so they come in dehydrated. The chemical that we use that takes lead out of their system also causes them to urinate more frequently, because what it does is it binds to the lead and then it's expelled out through the urates. Well, the problem is if they're extremely dehydrated already, you're giving them something that's a diuretic and causing more dehydration. The other thing is the chemical that we use doesn't know the difference between copper, zinc, lead, the things that we need in our system, or copper, zinc, we do need, lead we don't. And so basically it's just going to pull out everything. So now we have to try to replace that as well. And like I said, if the animal's not really able to eat or drink, it gets very difficult to do that. So it's an extremely difficult process to try to get this out. Now we're facing another major hurdle is the chemical that we use is called calcium versinate. And it's also used for people for hypocalcemic situations. So they give it to people as well. Right now there's a national shortage of the chemical. So we have not been able to get it for about 3 months, and they said it's going to be another 4 to 6 months before we can get it. And so that creates a huge problem. So any loons, eagles, swans that come in right now with lead poisoning basically will have to be euthanized because there is absolutely nothing we can do to remedy that. And so until we can get the chemical again, basically we're completely out of luck. So here's a x-ray of a loon. So you can see kind of where the red arrow is there. See the thing that doesn't belong? So that's a little jig head. The hooks and things dissolve very quickly with stomach acid. If a loon ingests a hook, usually within about 7 to 10 days, that hook will be completely dissolved and won't cause really any problem. So as long as there's no jig head or sinker, not really a big deal. But you can see on this one, there's a bunch of little rocks, but the one that glows a little bit more, that's the lead jig head. And you can see that the hook is already dissolved, but the jig head is still there. All the paint was off of it. And so you can see, basically this was a mix of the rocks that was in the proventriculus, the stomach of the loon, and the lead jig head that was in there as well. You can see all the paint wore off of it, and basically we had an extreme lead poisoning situation. So by the time we got this one in, it was about 95% dead and died about an hour after we got it in. And so the problem with these birds, like I said, they don't handle a lot of stress to begin with. And so to have somebody capture it, transport it, bring it in, try to find out what's going on with it. We do a lead test. Basically, we can take a blood sample. Within 3 minutes, we get our test back and know exactly what we're dealing with as far as lead. And we can start injecting the chemical right away if we have it. This particular loon, we ended up necropsying just to kind of get an idea of what was in there. So like I said, they'll pick up shotgun pellets sometimes that are settled on the bottom of the lakes. Like I said, they eliminated that in the 80s, but basically that stuff is still there. So swans, loons, ducks, things like that are picking these things up even after all these years. So swans are another one, like I say, that we get in quite a few of. And just about every one that we have, we see lead poisoning with. And we just had one here that we took in early April and had 4 shotgun pellets in its stomach. And we were basically just giving the chemical every single day. And it was too high to read initially when we came in for our lead analyzer. And we were able to keep on top of it. But then all of a sudden we ran out of the chemical and couldn't get any more. 4 days later, the swan passed away. And so that's kind of the sad situation that we're in right now. So you can see, this is another picture of a swan. Every single one of those is a shotgun pellet. And so now what they still do, they still trap shoot over just about every trap shooting facility you see is over water. And of course you see ducks swimming around down there. They pick up those lead particles and lead pellets. Then they get to be easy prey for an eagle and get taken by an eagle. And so like I said, once that gets in our ecosystem, it takes a long, long time for it to go away. So here's an example of a gunshot with a lead bullet. So they have, even though it's copper jacketed, these bullets are designed to expand when they go through a deer. So when that bullet goes through at a very fast velocity, basically it just almost explodes, ends up looking kind of like the solar system when you take an x-ray of it. So with this one particular shot here, they could count 547 particles just in one shot going through. And basically they're aiming for the heart and lung area. And of course, when somebody guts out the deer, these particles are in the heart, they're in the lungs, all the parts that nobody eats. So they just kind of dump it off to the side and take the deer home. And of course, the deer's got some particles in it as well. So we grind up the meat and the shoulders and things like that we don't want to make any mistakes, and we're eating lead ourselves. And so it's one of those things, we're poisoning ourselves as well as the animals. Well, then this gut pile sits out there, or if they don't find a deer, eagles come along, chickadees, ravens, blue jays, all these things that will feed on carcasses basically are picking up these little pellets. And the smallest pellet that you can see on there, the smallest little fragment, is enough to kill an eagle or a loon about 10 times over. So it doesn't take very much. One little dust-sized particle of lead is enough to cause lead poisoning. So it's very little amount that it takes to cause it. So the other thing we see with loons is a lot of fish hook type situations. So we get a lot of them that are hooked by hook and line. And of course, the accepted thing is, what do? You just cut the line. Well, that's a really bad situation. And so our organization does a lot of rescues and different things of loons. Sometimes it's very difficult to catch them, but if we are able to, we've got a much better chance if there's still a fishing line on there. We can slide a tube down over the line that kind of goes back over the hook, over the barb, and then we can pull the whole thing out. So we do have more of a chance to do it if somebody's able to bring it to us with the line still on it. And so it's a very difficult situation when we get these, because a lot of times, even with this amount of line, it's pretty difficult to do anything with it. So people are catching loons by mistake. The biggest thing is try to land the loon if you can, get it in a dark, quiet box, and basically call a wildlife rehabilitator and get it some help as quickly as possible. That's going to be its best chance. So these were just one summer that we worked with. So there's a loon researcher that's been doing loon research up here for over 25 years, Walter Piper with Chapman University out of California. So he comes down, has a crew of interns, and basically they're doing loon research throughout the entire summer. And so they ban the loons, they kind of monitor how many young there is, and how those particular loons are doing. So we've gone out with them several times, done some blood samples of the loons in their study, and found that most of them do have traces of lead, and some of them, in some cases, higher traces of lead. And so oftentimes they get mistakenly hooked, and so they basically go out at night. They have kind of a night capture technique that they do. So we work our short little day of 6:30 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. We meet them out at the boat landing at about 10 o'clock and go out in the boat. Basically, once they capture the loon, then we are able to hopefully get the hooks and lures off. And sometimes we have to bring them back for rehabilitation, and other times we can just get the hooks out and they can be let go right away. But loons are kind of what they call a wilderness animal, very high stress. So trying to deal with an adult loon in captivity is very difficult. So they don't do very well. So also are very expensive animals to feed. Basically, they'll cost you about $20 a day to care for a loon. So if you see how many minnows they eat, go to the bait shop and buy yourself a bunch of minnows. Basically, they'll go through probably about 2 dozen minnows every hour. And so very expensive to feed the little fellas. And like I said, they don't do stress well. It took us many years to figure out what we needed to do for loons. Of course, they're an animal that loves water. So you put them in water. 3 or 4 days later, they'd be dead. And so what we found out is they're very prone to something called aspergillosis, which is basically mold spores. And so if you have a very wet indoor type of environment, so if you have a cage or an enclosure that's inside, basically what happens, you start getting mold that you can't even see. So it starts spreading these spores, the loons inhale it, and basically they die very quickly. So they were kind of one of the oh crap animals that we would get in, knowing that if you didn't get them out the door in 3 or 4 days, they were going to die. And so now we found out the biggest thing is you can't let them have long exposure to water. You need to have drier situations, but also you need to make sure that they are on something that's padded, because they're not used to a lot of weight on their stomach and their chest. So basically that can cause a lot of problems there as well. So with loons, they're very heavy bodied. They're one of the few birds that actually have solid bones. Most birds have hollow bones. They're very poor on land because their legs are very far back on their body. So once they get on land, they're pretty much almost stuck. they can go short distances from one lake to another, kind of scooting themselves along, but for the most part, once they get on land, they're pretty well stuck. They're excellent swimmers, but not good on land. The young ones do pretty well, and we also get a call on a lot of young loons as well. So a lot of people think of these loons as being this beautiful, peaceful creature. They're really not. Oftentimes what will happen is a male loon will try to come in and take over the territory of another loon, and if he's successful, he will kill the chicks because they're not his own. And then he will try to breed with the female again to have chicks that are his own. And a lot of times the chicks will kind of see this coming, and they just get out of the water and they start heading out. And so we get in a lot of these chicks, and raising chicks in captivity can be very difficult as well. And so it's a situation where you can't just put them with a foster, real easily. So we've kind of developed some techniques to be able to do that as well. So sometimes we can get them with a foster family, but otherwise we have to try to raise them in captivity. And of course, you always wonder how loons are able to migrate the way they do, because the parents leave first. So they must be very good kids compared to kids today, because they must listen. They say, okay, when you get to that big rock, take a right, take a left at the big barn. So how it is the young ones can make it, it really is anybody's guess. It's one of the big marvels in wildlife, in general. So it's very common for them to fly, 500 miles a day. So typically what they'll do is head down to Florida in usually about 2 to 3 days they'll make it to Florida from the Northwoods. And then they usually spend a year or two down in Florida and then come back and start mating and breeding down here. So here was another particular situation where we had a large sinker in this loon. So what we do is a blood draw. So we have a lead analyzer. Our lead analyzer goes basically from 0 to 65 deciliters per deciliter, but if you want to consider it like parts per million. So each one of those point, whatever it is exponentially, higher. So in this particular case, if our analyzer goes up to 65, in this case, it's at high. So that means it's too high for our analyzer to read, so which means it's over 65. Clinically, they consider anything over 10 to be toxic levels. So when you're talking parts per million, if you will, by the time you get the difference between 10 and 65, it's huge. And so we have a situation now where this loon is in dire straits. So they say we take a blood sample. Easiest way is wing or leg. So we take a blood sample, put it in our analyzer. Analyzer takes 3 minutes, and basically we can start giving chemical at 3.5 minutes. And like I said, unless you get out the source of that lead, it makes it very, very difficult. And you can see in this particular loon, there's also another particle down here, and there's 2 more here. So not only did we have this big sinker here, we've got 2 more, or actually 3 more other small particles. So now the chances of getting this all out non-surgically, even, trying to get in with a scope, is almost impossible. So if we have a couple little particles, we might be able to chelate long enough to get those levels down, but most likely this animal is not going to survive. Like I said, most of the time they don't even survive the anesthetic. And so just by anesthetizing them, that's usually enough to put them over the edge because they come in so weak. Like I said, it hits them very quick. So you might see a loon swimming around in your front lake, one day, and everything looks great. And it might even be a short period of 6 to 8 hours later that basically they're almost comatose or having tremors, seizures. They'll beach themselves. And generally by the time we get them into wildlife rehabilitation, it's too late. There's almost nothing that we can do. So getting them to survive this is a very difficult situation. So the research team does a banding situation. They also have satellite transmitters on them, which unfortunately are kind of red and white and trailed behind them. So we get a lot of calls now for these loons that have a bobber stuck on them that's trailing behind them. And so we have to send them to the research website so they can see what a satellite transmitter looks like. In a lot of cases, it's just a satellite transmitter. So it's been great to have that information so they can find out how far, how fast the loons go and what they do, how fast they can migrate. But they have these different colored bands, so their researchers, basically their interns, will paddle around on these lakes and be able to identify these guys as they're preening and tipping upside down and scratching themselves. They can see the band colors, and so they'll usually have a metal band with numbers on it, and then any combination of different colors. And so the website, they also have a different listing of all the different band colors and stuff that are available. So a lot of times people don't know loon behavior, and unfortunately a lot of times vacation time coincides with when they're having the babies. and people always want to see how close they can get. And unfortunately, it's not good for the young ones. A lot of times they end up getting separated, or the little ones will dive down, try to hold on to something, and that actually will drown themselves just trying to get away from any kind of predators or people. And so trying to get people to give them their space is very difficult. Wave runners, jet skis, we have a lot of situations where people will actually run them over. And also people like to try to tame them down because they think it's pretty cool. So they start feeding them minnows and other fish that they catch. And of course that can be very detrimental as well because we get loons that are very humanized, and that can cause a lot of issues as well. A lot of times they get accidentally hooked. People will be fishing, and rather than just saying, okay, I'm going to wait a little while to cast or go someplace else on the lake, they'll just cast anyway and end up hooking the loon. So we have a lot of situations where we have entanglements and things, and not a good situation. And so this is more what we want to see with the natural beauty of loons. We don't want to have a situation where they're getting tangled, they're getting lead poisoning, but it's a matter of what we can do as sportsmen, if you will, people that are interested in hunting and fishing. We're not against hunting and fishing. We always say we're not against it. We don't want to try to eliminate it. We get donations of fish and venison every year. Without it, we wouldn't be able to feed our patients. And so we're just trying to make it safer. So for hunting, a lot of people say, well, it costs twice the amount for a box of ammunition than it does with the lead bullets. Lead bullets will cost you about $20, and the non-lead is about $40. Okay, there's 20 in a box. How many people shoot off more than 1 or 2 shells a year? So that box is going to last you, 5, 6, 7 years, maybe longer, depending on how good of a hunter you are. And so if you start averaging that out over the course of 5 years, so it's going to cost you an extra $5 a year. Big deal. By the time you do your blaze orange, your gas, going up to wherever your hunting shack is, that all costs a lot of money. It's a very small price to pay to keep our wildlife safe. And like I said, it's not just the eagles, loons, swans, it's all these animals that we don't think about, that we don't even know about necessarily, that are the after effects of lead. And so it's a situation where it's easily prevented. Like I said, we took it out of our gasoline, we took it out of our paint. Why can't we take it out of our fishing tackle and our, and our ammunition? And of course, there's been an ammunition shortage now for probably, 6 or 7 years. So a lot of people say, well, I can't get it, I can't find it. That's because they go to the sports shop a week before they go on their hunting trip and nobody has it. So be proactive. Start looking in April or May, or even January. Start going through the catalogs and ordering it through the mail. It's available in a lot of different supply places. And like I said, yes, it's going to cost a little bit more money, but it's a sound investment of our environment. So you look at shotgun shells as well. Like I said, for years, we used to use lead. So our lakes are now contaminated for probably forever. We'll never get it out of our system. So we're using steel shot for duck hunting and things now. It took a long time for people to kind of come around, but they finally are. And so they're safer alternatives. Fishing is a little bit more a rougher situation. You go into Walmart and you'll see 2 full aisles of fishing equipment, and the non-lead is about this big. And so what we need to do is, kind of give our retailers a little poke, try to get them to deal with some other things. The other thing is, there again, mail order. There's different things available. There's different safer alternatives out there. Even with bullets for deer hunting, they found that these special different copper bullets are actually more effective. They have better killing power, they're more accurate, and they're actually better than the lead bullets. The problem we face is anytime we try to regulate anything, everybody feels like we're taking away their freedoms. It's like, no, you're going to take away our ammunition, then our guns, and like I said, we're not trying to do that, we're just trying to make it safer. So the biggest thing is when you're trying to spread the word, just try to tell people we're not trying to take anything away from you, we're just trying to save our environment and make it a little bit safer for all the different animals. Because like I said, it's not just a few that we see, but who wants to come up and not hear the loons at night, not see the loons on our lake? It's a situation where it takes away from all of us and all the freedoms that we have. So, why should some people be able to decide that they can use these things that are poisoning the animals, and so we can't see it because they're not using what is safer for the animals? Well, maybe 4 minutes left over. Pretty good.
I want to borrow these couple of minutes just to stitch these things together, what you just heard. So Mike talked about policy. It is a policy question that we were just hinting at about whether or not lead is going to be in the environment. If you dig into this issue, if anybody's dug into it, you'll find that anytime it's proposed to do sort of wholesale changes on lead ammunition, a group of industry people will come out of the woodwork and sink it. And loons, in particular, they're long-lived species. They can continue to be reproducing well into 20, I think up to 30 years old. So the loons that we have, they're healthy and they're great, but the population in Wisconsin and most of the upper Midwest is not growing. It's basically flat, which is because the artificial mortality is taking a toll on them. Really, they should be expanding in population size, but they're getting these artificial means of population suppression. And another thing that they're facing, the juvenile loons, the young ones he's talking about, they don't actually follow their parents, because their parents are smart like a lot of you. They go south in the winter. The juvenile loons are a little crazy. They go straight east, many of them. A lot of them will meet up in Lake Michigan, and then they get to talk to their buddies, and they decide to go further east. They go off the shore of New England, and they spend the winter out there just eating a whole bunch of fish. Well, that pause in between when they meet up in Lake Michigan, it turns out that because of the invasive species in Lake Michigan, the bottom-dwelling algae that was mentioned, sometimes this is called Cladophora, that bottom-dwelling algae floats up in these big mats. People have heard about these stinky mats of Cladophora on the Great Lakes. Those mats can actually foster a population of botulism, bacteria, I believe. Am I right, Gretchen? Botulism is a bacteria. It's a chemical. And this excessive amount of botulism then can accumulate in these loons and kill them. So periodically you hear about loon die-offs out in the Great Lakes, and it's really in part because of zebra and quagga mussels filtering out those Great Lakes. All this sort of implicates us. We've been involved in all these changes. So why do we have to go above and beyond to support them and to fight for them and to protect them? Why is it worth your time to tell people to please give them the space in the summer that they need? It's because we're the reason why they have this artificially suppressed population. So I enjoin you to please step up for these loons. Please spend some time talking to Mark and finding out specific ways you can support their effort. We're up on a break now. We have about 15 minutes to go hang out, maybe grab some snacks if you're out there. Definitely talk to Mark and talk to Gretchen and talk to Mike too if you have very specific questions you want to answer. We're going to have time at the end of the morning for more questions. When we return here at 10:45, we're going to have our panel. So we're going to get into some more interactive discussion. But thank you, and we'll see you here in about 15 minutes. This next session is basically kind of the theme of the meeting this year. Who are you going to call? And these 5 folks up in front are some of the folks you're going to call. You might not be able to reach them directly right away, but they're the kind of folks that handle a lot of sort of thorny questions around rules and enforcement. What we're going to do is kind of start off with some quick introductions by the panelists themselves, talking about who they are and briefly describing their responsibilities as it relates to enforcing rules and laws, either at the county or at the state and regional scale. So we're going to start off to closest to me, Darren Kuhn. He's a Wisconsin DNR conservation officer. Darren?
Thanks. This is a really pretty cool event to attend. I mean, I actually learned a lot about the invasive species, and I found that the loon presentation extremely interesting. But a lot of you in this room have seen me. My name is Darren Kuhn. I'm the boating law administrator for the Wisconsin DNR, which basically means pretty much anything having to do with boating or enforcement of boating, whether on the local, state, municipal level, waterway markers, local boating ordinances is sort of my bailiwick. I'm officially out of central office out of Madison, but when I took this position, I refused to leave Green Bay. So while my office technically is in Madison, my actual mailing address is Green Bay. So I'm happy to be here. I thought I was going to be one of the furthest ones because it's about a 3-hour drive for me to get here, but Iowa, I can't believe that. And in Milwaukee for that matter too. But so my role here is basically more of a statewide perspective on questions or interests that people in the group may have. I'm certainly not the person to call for something that's going on in local Oneida County or any of the counties that are represented here, unless you're from Brown County, and then I'll be more than happy to go out on a boat again, because most of my time is spent in front of a computer or talking on a microphone somewhere.
All right, and next we have Tim Otto. He's a Wisconsin DNR Conservation Warden. Tim?
Yes, my name is Tim Otto. I'm the local conservation warden for the Department of Natural Resources. And in a nutshell, my responsibilities are fish and game enforcement, environmental enforcement, as well as recreational vehicle enforcement. Specifically, I do those tasks in a relatively small area. I'm stationed in my administrative area, is what we would call it. Some people might call it a beat, but my beat or administrative area is entirely in Oneida County, and I am one of 2 field wardens for Oneida County right now. And I guess if you want our team, which includes Oneida and Vilas, I am one of 4. So I guess to some degree I can answer some questions, provide a local field warden perspective, but as far as like some of your questions about your specific lake, if it's not in my administrative area, I'm not the right guy, sorry.
And then next we have Michael Barine. He's an Oneida County Sheriff Deputy.
So I'm Michael Barron. I've been with Oneida County for 8 years now. A big part of my job is our recreational safety classes. So I teach our boat safety, snowmobile, ATV, and then hunter safety classes as well. Obviously our job as deputies, we enforce normal laws and regulations, but we can also venture on to the DNR side, and we do enforce boating regulations and have our recreation patrol as well that we partake in, especially on the weekends when we have a lot of visitors from other parts of the area.
And next we have Carl Jenrich from the Oneida County Zoning Office, where he's the director.
Good afternoon. I'm Carl Jenrich from Oneida County Zoning. I don't think you guys got the memo. We were supposed to be wearing some colorful shirts. It's a Friday. And again, I don't carry a taser and I don't carry a gun like these gentlemen do. Again, my job is to administer various chapters of the Oneida County zoning ordinance, which include shoreline zoning provisions, non-metallic mining provisions, general zoning provisions that include, for example, dilapidated structures, tourist swimming houses, mobile tower siting, and a lot of other regulations. But again, we deal with a lot of different situations and different agencies and try to administer those codes. And we also enforce those codes when needed.
All right, and last but not least, Erica, I want to say Reiter?
Reiter, yeah.
Erica Reiter is the director of, not director, she's the administrator of Iron County Zoning.
I am Erica Reiter, Iron County Zoning Administrator, been there for about 10 years. Much like Carl, I cover every ordinance that zoning upholds. Some he didn't mention are things like floodplain. We work on shoreline buffers. I know that's why we're all here is lake protection. Zoning has a big part in lake protection.
All right, so I'm going to kick things off with some questions that were fed to me by the organizers of the conference. And we could just start with Erica and come back this way, I guess, with your responses. The first question is just, what do you see as the single biggest challenge that you face in seeing that the laws affecting natural resources and public safety are observed by the public? So what's the biggest challenge you would say you face sort of in your day-to-day law enforcement or rule enforcement role?
Day-to-day, trying to educate the public that we aren't there to just kill their dreams. That is the hardest. We unfortunately end up telling people that they can't do what they had hoped. They didn't call us up ahead of time, which is a big deal. If you are buying or your friend is buying a piece of property or a home, please call ahead of time, ask questions. We don't want to be the people that kill your dreams. That would be the hardest, probably the hardest thing that we face day to day is those phone calls of letting someone down.
Carl, you let anybody down?
Is this a therapy session?
So again, what would you say is the biggest challenge you face in seeing that these rules and laws are enforced?
The biggest challenge is, I think, Oneida, Vilas, Iron counties in particular, because of the number of lakes, we see a lot of pressure. And by pressure, like Erica stated, is that there's a lot of people that are coming up here that really have a lot of dreams of what they want to do with their property. Homes are not getting smaller, they're getting a lot bigger. They want to do a lot of things that are associated with some of the places that they come from. For example, landscaping right up to the water, basically re-altering or altering their landscape. And it's sometimes difficult to tell people what the rules and regulations are and why they are. Again, a lot of people come up to these lakes to enjoy them. And again, slowly over time, what we're seeing is that, you know, the natural landscapes are being changed to more of a, if you want to call it a man-made landscape. But we are seeing over the last, 20 years of my career, just a lot more people coming up here to try to get a piece of the paradise. And it's just harder and harder and harder just with the pressures that are coming up with people wanting to do a lot of things that, NR 115 and our shoreline zoning ordinances don't allow. Again, I try to articulate to people, you come up here to relax. Why do you need a lawn to mow? But again, it's a personal choice of the individuals that come up here. And again, it's trying to educate them in a nice and responsible way of why we have the regulations. And really the bottom line is to protect the lake that they're investing a lot of money in to build their home because they want to be up here because they love the lake.
Okay. Pass the mic on. From a county sheriff perspective, sheriff deputy's perspective, what do you see as the biggest challenge?
I mean, similar to them, obviously people aren't worried so much about the shoreline, but we get a lot of, I didn't know that, or I wasn't aware that was a rule when people are up here from, say, out of state or even southern Wisconsin. The rules for Wisconsin are pretty unified for boating regulations. I know it differs once we touch, the Great Lakes, but for our inland lakes, there's a lot of information that people don't take the time to read, and then they kind of feel that it's really not a big deal once they violate those rules. And it kind of seems from what I've dealt with, it doesn't affect them because they're up here on vacation. So they're only up here a couple weekends doing whatever they feel fit, and then they go back home to not having a lake and carrying on with their life.
Right. And Tim, how about from a conservation warden perspective, biggest challenges?
I think the biggest challenge that we face as wardens, quite frankly, is staffing levels. Right now, I said this in my introduction, that I'm one of 4 field wardens for Oneida and Vilas County. One of those field wardens is responsible for doing the campground enforcement in the Northern Highland. So that position is basically taken up with the Northern Highland responsibilities, which again leaves 3 of us then for an area, with just such a high concentration of lakes and rivers, the headwaters of so many of these watersheds too, and the conflict that arises, whether it be from an environmental perspective with some of the shoreline development, or even just the boating conflicts that arise. Kind of touching on some of the staffing levels and where we're at, not even just in those counties, but I can speak to some of our surrounding counties too, and kind of how the staffing levels are at right now. So in Oneida County, we currently have 2. Vilas, there's 2. Florence County, there isn't anybody in Florence. There isn't anybody in Forest County. Price County doesn't have anybody. Iron County, I believe, is lacking a field warden. Lincoln, we're fortunate to have 2 fully staffed there. Langley County, another surrounding county. We went from what has historically been 2 conservation wardens, we're down to 1 permanent conservation warden for the county. So, and of course, in that time, in about a 20-year span, 30-year span, we're seeing our staffing levels drop in this part of the state, but at the same time, the rise of more influx, as Carl hit on, an influx of more people, more population, more weekend visitors and tourists and stuff. So there's a greater stress on the resource, but our staffing levels are going down. 40 years ago, I think my predecessors were probably not concerned about personal watercraft, wake boats, and things like snowmobiles were an afterthought. So I really believe it's our staffing levels.
Great. And then back to Darren.
I want to expand and put things in perspective, and I think a group in northern Wisconsin will understand this just a little bit. Right now, from perspective, and to go to staffing and user groups and expanding on user conflicts and resource use. Right now, we have more registered boats in the state of Wisconsin than we have deer hunters. Think about that. There's all sorts of, lots of people in the woods. We have more registered boats than deer hunters. We have more we vary, the state of Wisconsin, when it comes to registered boats, vary between number 3 to number 5 in the entire country. Think about that. Florida, it's all coastal. How many, all the water that's down there, it's year round. But we go between 3 to 5, in that range, 3, 4, 5, annually on the number of registered boats in the entire country. And our staffing is a big issue. But to get back to the question at hand, and I think it goes with staffing, I think it goes with users, I think it goes with education. But and I'm going to say education for a number of reasons. One, a lot of times, especially up here where it's such a high tourist density, people don't treat the land or the waters or the resources like they own it. It goes back to the expression, drive it like you stole it. Well, kind of deal. They come up here, pristine Northwoods in Wisconsin, and they just do what they want to do because they don't understand the impact that it has on the people that actually reside here. Maybe that's intentional, maybe it's unintentional, who knows? But it's definitely present. We don't have the land or the resource respect, and I think that goes back to education of the people using our resources. And it also goes back to education on how to use the tools or the machinery that they're using. And this applies to boats, this applies to snowmobiles, this applies to ATVs, this applies to shoreline and land use. You've got to be careful. A lot of our laws are very old. Our laws cannot keep up with technology. When boating laws were designed or created, we didn't have 300 horsepower outboards, or we didn't have tri-tunes with twin 300 outboard motors on it. Grandpa's pontoon is a thing of the past. I mean, when you can ski behind a pontoon boat, my gosh, the laws weren't designed for that. Personal watercraft, new on the horizon relatively. Wake surfing, new on the horizon. Our laws can't keep up, so we need to explain to our users and educate our users that the act of one affects more than just them. Hunting, boating, fishing, snowmobiling, ATV, you name it. A lot of our laws are bad apple laws. They're based on what a very small percentage of the user population has done that has created problems, but it affects more than just them. It affects everyone in this room, it affects everyone on this stage, it affects our generations to come, but it's all through education. Now, education in many different forms, but education nonetheless, because our users need to be more aware of what they're doing and how it affects more than just their individuals and their what they want to do doesn't make it necessarily right all the time.
That's fascinating that a lot of you are mentioning education, and yet it seems like we're at a time when information is flowing all the time, everywhere. That people have smartphones in their wallet, in their pocket, that they could pull up the rules and regulations. Have any of you seen somebody sort of effectively using maybe new technologies to do this education, whether it's the internet or whether it's other forms of modern communications? How can we leverage, I guess, what new resources there are, especially thinking that this audience might be coming from a more urban environment?
And I think we're doing what we can. I mean, there's all sorts of different medium out there. I know, historically it was, Warden standing at a county fair. Well, that's great. You can get a hold of, however many people come to the Warden booth that might be at the tent, but they're more excited about going to the grandstand or getting to the corn dog shop, whatever it might be. So we've progressed through, at least from the DNR perspective, and we really do have a pretty big social media presence. I'm not personally a social media person, so I'm gonna butcher it, but I mean, we've got Twitter feeds and we have Instagram and Facebook accounts and all sorts of different social media platforms that we put information out constantly. It's just a matter of people want to go look for it. Our regulations, everything is online. Our safety classes are all online, and whether a lot of people will say we need our boater education or ATV education or hunter education in person. Well, the fact of the matter is, in today's society, we've had to come to the fact that while I might not disagree with you, people don't want to spend one weekend in a classroom or one day, 2 hours for 6 weeks in a classroom. They want to get it done now. We're in a society of instant gratification and everything's at your fingertips. So we had to adjust and make our education classes online. And we have a huge number of students taking our different safety classes online. But it just keep punching it out. We've tried, billboards, electronic billboards on roadside, on the interstates as people come up north to vacation, boat safety messaging. We've partnered with the Milwaukee Admirals to talk about wearing helmets, comparing ATVs and snowmobiles to ice hockey. We're partnering with the Madison Mallards to talk about anything safety related, Green Bay Gamblers again. And again, these are more metro areas because that's where our people are coming from to come up here to play. People come up north to leave and get away. So we're trying the best we can with social media, different outlets, trying to overcome, maybe getting away a little bit of written press. I mean, there's not a whole lot of newspapers around anymore. It's all online and trying to get that online. We have media coverage at events like this. This is great. I did a TV interview, before the panel of let's spread safe boating. Let's spread the message of AIS and get it out to as many people as we possibly can to try to get that more electronic footprint.
I want to throw that back to Michael basically, because you do some of those in-person workshops and education and the trainings. Are you seeing a change in how people respond to the in-person? And do you see people maybe not wanting to come just because of the time commitment?
I mean, I'm gonna boost myself because people like coming to class. I don't know if I could put on enough up here in the Northwoods. I really don't. I have people ask me that have taken previous classes, hey, when's the next hunter safety class? Hey, when are you doing boater safety? When are you doing ATV? Because up here, it seems at least, people want their kids coming in person, listening to me for whatever reason. But they also get our side of it when we're teaching because we're the ones that respond when things go bad. And we touch on that in the class, and I don't shy away from that with the kids. Obviously, we're not sharing, the super graphic pictures, but we do bring that reality into them, and I think I've seen that have a bigger effect on some of these students, and especially their parents, because we tell them, hey, share it with your parents, let them know what you learned. So I don't see a decline up here, at least. Kids want to come in. Me working in the schools for 3 years as our elementary school resource officer, I think helped too, because now they did take a class with Deputy Barron, so that's pretty cool. But we bring a lot. I have a lot of volunteer instructors. Mr. Otto here helps me out a lot. He comes in, talks to the kids. They get to see who they might meet out if they violate one of those rules, or who's checking on them just to make sure they're being safe. So I try to make it as user-friendly, as cop-friendly as I can to let kids know we're there for them. Our rules that we have are to protect them, and parents keep sending their kids to our class because I do believe it is beneficial. So I don't know if I could hold enough. I could probably hold one twice a month and it would be full. So there's still the need for it, at least up here for right now.
Great. Carl, you said you've been in zoning for how long?
I'm a dinosaur, 25.
So I'm picturing 25 years ago, probably not many people had a copy of the zoning code on their own person, that they would just sort of find it somehow and generate it. But today, that's probably different, right? They can go online and actually get the code. Do you think people are acting differently? Like, are they reading the code before they come to you to kind of see if you're really going to follow what you put?
Not really. We deal with a lot of different clients. I mean, we have a lot of builders that, yes, they understand the ordinance, they work on behalf of their constituents, so to speak, and they know what's expected when they come in for permits. When you talk about education in our world, at this time of the year, we're just holding on for the ride. By that, I mean, we are just inundated by permits. I mean, our department issues close to 700 sanitary permits a year, well over 1,000 building permits, and not just for homes on water. We issue conditional use permits, administrative review permits, sign permits, so there's a lot of areas that we regulate. And again, we're busy during the summer months. So really the only time we have to educate someone, at least if it's regarding a shoreline property, is at the time that person comes in and gets a permit. Most homeowners, they try, but it's a difficult system to maneuver through. I mean, they don't understand the ins and outs of shoreline zoning, of what you can and can't do to a structure closer than 75 feet, what you can and can't do to a structure closer than 35 feet, what you can and can't do for landscaping than 75 feet. So basically, when they come in, they have these ideas, like Erica stated. We try to facilitate what they want as best we can, but there are a lot of instances where we have to say, no, you can't do what you want to do. But again, our education, for the most part, is when that individual comes in for a permit application. We do have some information that is provided by the lakes that we give out. A lot of people are interested in that. But again, most of the people at that time, they just want to get a permit to build their dream project and get out of there.
Erica, any innovative technology use in Iron County that you want to share?
We don't have any specific. Iron County just got a Facebook page, so that's how up on it we are. Like Carl, in the summertime, we're just hanging on.
And again, a lot of our rules and regulations are online, which they can look at, but again, you're looking at a piece of paper, you're looking at a regulation. Again, we have a joint department with Land and Water Conservation, and they're more dynamic, they're more social media, they're more out with the lake groups. Again, we do some outreach when a lake association wants me to come to talk about various zoning issues, we go. When a town wants us to come and talk about zoning issues, we go. When the builders want us to, come to a builders association meeting to talk about new regulations, typically we go. But we're not a Facebook, whatever you want to call it, media type of organization. Most counties aren't, at least in zoning.
Tim, one question for you then, before we maybe open this up for general questions from the audience. You mentioned a warden kind of being assigned to the parks area and working on campground types of things. I can see how that pulls a lot of time out of a person, but is there an upside to that? Is there sort of a benefit of that interaction with the park visitors?
I guess I don't really know. I'm not that position. I have certainly spent some time in our campgrounds. That's a full-time position. One person kind of is assigned to that. That's their administrative area. There's supposed to be 2 positions assigned to it. We have 1. Again, a staffing issue. So some of us that aren't technically, that's not our administrative area, just because of the vacancy, we do get pulled in and have to work in those campgrounds. It's all give and take. If I'm in the campgrounds, I'm not on the lakes. It's not uncommon for me when I am working outside my administrative area to get other complaints in my administrative area, just as I think in this morning's presentations, I think I had 2 different hotlines that occurred out of my administrative area because wardens that cover those areas were unavailable for various reasons. And here I am, I'm choice number 3, I think, in some of those calls, and I'm not available either. So I don't want to say that there isn't an upside, but it's all a give and take. I mean, those are user groups that we, the DNR, contact and use. It's a user group that comes up to the Northwoods from a tourism standpoint. They're bringing some economic benefit. They are also our lake users, so it does give us an opportunity to interact with them there. But my experience is that it's been on a different perspective. Not to say that the campground visitors aren't on the lakes, but because a lot of them are, but that's not what our contacts are over a lot of times.
Got it. Well, now you've all gotten a sense of who these panelists are and their sort of domain of expertise. I guess we'll open it up to questions from the floor. And we have a gentleman here who's got the microphone so that you don't have to shout. But I think we just ask people to raise their hand. And I see a woman over here.
My name's Patty, and I'm a Clean Boats, Clean Waters Inspector on Lake Lucerne in Forest County. And as Warden Otto said, we do not have a warden at this time. I have experienced having to contact a tip line due to weeds on trailers for fishing tournaments. And it's been 2 weekends now. The first one, and I take copious notes, license plate numbers, everything. The first time I spoke to Brad in Langley County, and he basically at the end of our conversation said that if I couldn't come to court and verify if he ticketed, that I was 100% sure those weeds on those trailers, and it was 7 trailers on 10 boats, or 7 trailers for 10 vehicles, had weeds, water weeds on them. And he said if I couldn't testify in court 100% that even if he did offer a ticket to these people that and would come down, it would be dismissed by our court system. So I was basically told I'm not going to bother. It happened again last weekend. I had 12 boats for a bass tournament. I did my inspection. 8 of them had weeds on the trailers. I called, I got no call back. Why can't our courts stand behind you and be a revenue generator so you have more money to spend protecting us and our lakes?
I'll let Darren start on that one.
Yeah, I'm glad to see that they handed the mic this way. The honest answer, and I can't be more bold about it, is I don't know. We as the Warden Service, working for the Department of Natural Resources, there's a lot of times we don't get the support. I mean, jokingly when we came in, I said to the sheriff's deputy, I said, you guys are off the hook, the DNR's here in the Northwoods, we're gonna take all the heat. And in some counties, that honestly is the case. And it's not just aquatic invasive species in some areas of the state, it's fish and game. It's recreational vehicles. And why AIS is important to everyone in this room and should be important to anyone in the state of Wisconsin and around the country, to some people, and some of those people may be decision makers or litigators, it doesn't fall within their comfort zone and or willingness to do it. To agree with Brad, I think you mean Warden Brad Dahlquist, I think that's his area. He's right. You know, he would know his local court system. And if a citation was issued based on your information provided, my guess is you would be called as a witness and would have to testify, swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And without that, and without that certainty, my guess is in that particular court system, it would get dismissed. The bigger issue that you ask about is why can't we get more support for all the stuff that everyone on this panel does. And I think you heard the presentation this morning about budget issues. I can't answer it. And I think anyone that's heard me speak before knows that I'm going to shoot about as straight as I can without getting myself in too much trouble. But that's the honest to God answer is I can't give you a square answer on that. I don't know.
Darren, let me ask you real quick. Is a conservation warden the only person that can issue a ticket on trailering with aquatic plants?
It would depend on, so the conservation wardens definitely have that legal authority to do that. It would also go back to if there's a county ordinance relative to that, or if local zoning had different rules on transporting aquatic invasives. So the answer is not necessarily, but maybe.
So Darren, I'm going to ask you to pass the mic down because I saw Michael shaking his head and I want to get some clarification because I think it's important, and then we'll get Carlin.
So we as a county adopted, kind of on the natural resource, we have county ordinance citations that we can issue. It's I originally went to be a warden, but then I wanted to be like the fun cop, right? But it's cool because up here we get to enforce all those rules as well. So I've issued tickets for transporting aquatic invasives. We just had one come in yesterday with picture evidence of weeds hanging off a trailer. Called the guy, discussed what happened. The other deputy did whatever he decided to do with that one. But we can, as a sheriff's department, issue those citations. Pictures help, boat trailers help, all those numbers that it appears that you got, that helps us. And we can go forward and issue those citations. And most of us that work at the sheriff's department enjoy the lakes too. So we want to keep them as clean as we can so we don't have a problem enforcing those rules and regulations.
I think you mentioned something important though. Your county has adopted an ordinance that gives you that. Do you know, or maybe do we know if all counties do that, or is it county by county?
I don't know if all counties do it. I would imagine it's probably county by county. But for us, I think due to as many lakes as we have, they went through and adopted that so that we have that ability to write those citations.
Sure.
Eric and panel, if I could add something here. It would seem to me in a situation like this lady described, and I'm a watercraft inspector myself on my lake, that actual pictures of the weeds on the boat, on the trailer, and pictures of the license plates of the vehicles pulling these trailers and anything else like that would be conclusive enough proof for the county sheriff representative to issue a citation, even if not right on the spot, because you can't get them there right on the spot. What strength of validity is there to what I just said? The lady says she has pictures.
So, it's the justice system, all right? Everyone's innocent until proven guilty. Okay? Pictures help. She's still probably going to be called to testify because she's the one that took those pictures. I don't have a problem writing citations based on that, knowing that she's going to show up to court. If I don't have that cooperation, it's going to be a little trickier. But if I have someone that's willing to do that, if she is called to testify, because she's the one taking the pictures, I'm not. I'm not testifying to her pictures. So that's kind of where we struggle if it goes to a court trial. I know what I did, but I'm gonna have that other person that took that evidence testify that they took it the way that they took it. So.
I'd like to add just something really fast, because I know there was other hands up and we don't want to get stuck on one question. But sometimes, like again, to me it comes back to some of our staffing issues that Brad just, he's the warden in Langley County and used to be the warden in Forest County, so that poor sap is getting the calls for Forest and Langley County right now because of that. So he's got to triage his calls and his efforts. Same as realistically all of us do. And if, I don't know your specific example, but I'm just saying as a general rule that a lot of times if we're not comfortable that we don't know that there's going to be really solid evidence brought forth, that we're not going to be able to spend a lot of our time and efforts on a particular case. Now along with that is we also have some experience with our local court systems. And I mean, to me, like the really short and sweet answer to your question would be, I don't know why the courts don't give you better support, contact your courts. I mean, that would be like the really short and sweet answer, that if you, which ultimately I think what their response is going to be, and I shouldn't speak for them, but my experience is that when they're dealing, when you look at our court systems, look at our prosecutors' offices, our judges and stuff like that, and when we bring an aquatic vegetation citation to them, they're going to look at that and they're going to say, what? I have never seen that. By the way, I've got 3 meth house cases that I'm dealing with over here, and a couple, some other high-level felony cases. They have to prioritize their cases too. And unfortunately, that sometimes cases that some of us in here are passionate about, they don't necessarily get the attention that we feel that they should deserve. And again, it kind of comes back to some of that staffing. It's not that they don't think that our stuff is important, but sometimes it doesn't rise to that level in their office as a priority.
Over here is next.
I have a question for Carl, please. Sure. Carl Lynn Larson from Vilas County. I talked to you a couple times. First, you're to be commended that you guys have developed a tourist rooming house requirements. A major issue now is right to rent and overcapacity of properties. I'm a realtor, also educator, 42 years, realtor 45 years, and I see this egregious issue going on. And I've documented, I've gone into septic capacities, room dimensions of 3-bedroom homes occupying 22 people. Okay, it is a major issue going on with us. So first year to be commended, I'm going to read your policy, which I like very much. Basically, it says maximum occupancy for a tourist rooming house served by a private on-site wastewater treatment system is limited to the number of occupants for which the POWTS was designed. Okay, I want to ask you on that. Or the occupancy granted by the state tourist rooming house license, which is 400 cubic feet per bedroom. First, 3-bedroom, 2-bath home on a lake in Rhinelander. When you go through application, are you guys establishing that that occupancy can be 6 or 8, or are you staying completely away from that?
How long do you want to talk? We do limit it to 6 people, 2
Great.
people per bedroom. But you want to talk enforcement? This is a cat and mouse game.
Yeah, so I understand that.
Oneida County decided to regulate tourist rooming houses in 2018, and again, it is a large workload on the department because we're getting 200 plus applications a year. We're getting probably about that same amount of complaints a year, and then again, like you're talking about evidence. There's a lot of people that are complaining that the house has 15 people for the weekend. You go online to take a look at the advertisement. It's advertised for 6 people, or a maximum occupancy of 6 people for 3-bedroom home. I cannot go forward and enforce unless I have some type of evidence from the neighbors that basically says, that there's 15 people that are there.
Okay, I don't want to interrupt, but I just want to share something.
Yep.
If I gave you this evidence, I can give you 5 examples on their website in my folder right now of homes that I've researched and have the septic size, and they're advertising 22, 18, and 14 in 3 and 4 bedroom. If you have that kind of information, would you at least contact owners through a letter and say, hey, listen, that seems to be exceeding what we have?
Yes, we automatically send a letter basically to come into compliance with either if they don't have a permit to come in and get an after-the-fact permit, or if they have a permit, we ask them to come into compliance. If they don't come into compliance, we start issuing citations. If that doesn't work, we basically do a long-form complaint.
Okay, I'll finish up with this. Thank you so much for what you're doing. We are gaining momentum at Vilas County at the zoning administration level. I have presented, and Dave Saturnaras, I'm sure he will contact you. He's written an excellent way to go about this. We're going to keep it very simple. We're going to base it on occupancy and septic sizing, just to really make the process easy, and looking at additional staffing now for the 4 months over summer. Thank you.
And Iron County has an ordinance too.
Got a question over here.
Sure. This is a little lighter, I think, and it's mostly for Carl and Erica, a zoning question. So what, if any, effort is being made to educate the companies like the excavators and the landscape companies on shoreline zoning? Because I feel like I'm on Two Sisters Lake, and for the years since the 70s, you wouldn't see a house, and all of a sudden the excavator comes in and cuts everything down, all the trees, all the vegetation down the water, and then the property owner gets shamed. And what efforts are there just to kind of educate the contractors and the other people?
I can speak for myself, not enough. Again, we try to have outreach, or at least with the builders. I know we had a meeting up in Minocqua, but that was on a different issue with the landscapers, excavators. They had concerns with how we regulate. But we at least try to talk to them on the site, at least with different excavators, because there are, I don't want to say a handful, but there are a number of excavators that do a majority of the work. And we do try to work with them just to tell them what the regulations are. But again, you have different excavators, different landscapers that come from out of the area, and they're saying, well, Lincoln County lets me do that, or Lake County lets me do that, or Iron County lets me do that, or whatever. And so it's tough from that perspective.
I would agree. You have some landscapers and excavators that call before they touch anything. You have other landscapers who call after they've touched it and say, maybe I did something wrong. You have excavators that never call. and you find them later. And that's the situation where the homeowner, it's their responsibility because it's their property and they hired the excavator. It's unfortunate in our job to have to say you're responsible for what you trusted this person to do, but there's no one else that we can hold accountable really, again, without evidence and without, you know, some sort of teeth to get it done.
Right here. Okay, up in the back.
I live on the lake in Vilas County, and about a month ago, a private plane landed on the lake, went up the lake a few hundred yards, turned around, and then took off. Is that legal?
Yes.
Yeah, so, and it hits to a point that, again, these lakes belong to everybody. They're publicly owned lakes. Even a lake that's 100% surrounded by private property, a person accessing that lake via a seaplane is fully within their rights to land that seaplane because the lake itself is public domain.
There's someone here.
How about it if it's no wake lake?
Yes.
There's going to be a really tough balance that the people on this panel.
The reality is,
Yeah.
I guess I've never had that question, and that was my shoot from the hip, and now that I had another 5 seconds to think about it, the reality is that the slow and awake law applies to boats, and airplanes are not boats. I mean, a very strict legal definition, they're two separate entities. The no wake provision would not apply to an aircraft.
Eric, we have somebody here.
Hi, I'm Doug Brown. I was raised on Little Lake Julia here, right on the campus site, and I have noticed since I was younger the tremendous increase in wildlife or waterfowl on the lake. And I've done boat inspections as part of the Lake Julia Association. I think the inspections throughout all the lakes have done very well. But should we be concerned of the waterfowl transporting the invasive species, especially this little flea that's microscopic?
Maybe. You know, I mean, from listening to the conversation earlier today, I would say that, yeah, there probably might be some level of concern there. I would take yours and maybe not, you know, and I'm not familiar with the area and where hunting is allowed or not allowed as far as waterfowl, but I think our bigger concern is as you have waterfowl show up in different locations, you have waterfowl hunters show up where they're allowed to do so. And you start thinking about dogs and the dogs that run out. No one cleans their dog, you know, scrubs them. Well, I shouldn't say that, depends how smelly the water is, I guess. But thinking pristine northern Wisconsin lakes, they're not going to be all that awfully smelly. But your dog could just as easy get into that. Decoys, your decoy lines. I'm a duck hunter, and I probably don't do as good of a job as I should cleaning my decoy lines that may very well collect the invasive species that we were talking about this morning. So my concern wouldn't necessarily be as much as to the waterfall itself, but what the waterfall brings and going that route.
I'm not sure if Gretchen is still here. She's back. So I think science too looks at this and says, well, let's look for this evidence. You know, if the idea is that natural pathways would allow for species to move from lake to lake, then we should find lakes that don't have an obvious human-caused pathway. The only way for it to get there would have been natural movement by like waterfowl or a bird. And do we find like Eurasian water milfoil or zebra mussels or even the spiny water flea in lakes where we wouldn't expect to find it at all? Pass the mic all the way down for Gretchen. And we are gonna, as we pass the 11:30, we'll broaden it out. So it could be for the panel or it could be for any of the presenters.
So it's possible, right? I think that is possible. We definitely know of parasites that get shifted around by waterfowl into different systems. And so it is a possibility, but is that, how do you document that and how do you really keep track of that, right? I think what that brings to light is if you can keep them out of a region, right? Working toward limiting the number of exposures those waterfowl have, the probability of them bringing it is going to be lower. So that's where some of this broader thinking of not just one lake, but
how do we manage those as a region is where that becomes very important. The Great Lakes have a lot of things in them, and we do see that there's kind of this stepwise movement of things out of it. I think humans are a huge part of that, but I think there are natural vectors, and that's part of the ecosystem. We're part of that, and I think that's what we have to think about.
But even when we model like stream or hydraulically connected systems, where it seems like the zebra mussels should just be washing downstream, or these other things should just be going down with the current, we don't always find them downstream. It's not easy necessarily for them to move around.
Yeah, it's a game of probabilities, right? The more common they are, the more likely they're going to move. And so they get the abundance and then they transport. So it is definitely a probabilities.
Eric, right here.
Question in the back.
Hi, Deb McFadden from Vilas County, Big River Vital Lake. We came to a conference.
Can you speak into the mic?
Sorry, we came to a conference titled "Who Are You Going to Call?" and now we know a little bit about that, but I think maybe we need some of the other question words. Like for me, it's when you're going to call, knowing what the limitations are. What are the panel's priorities about things that we should make you aware of?
It's a pretty good question. So, when does that threshold get hit? What sort of calls do you wish people would?
Violations, of course, are something you want to call about. Grading in the shoreline, grading in the water. If you are boating by and there is a vast open area of exposed dirt, that is something you're going to call a zoning department about. Please take pictures. We can't enter people's property without their permission, and if they're about to get in trouble and have to fix what they did, they're unlikely to invite us. So if you can get pictures from a lot line or the water, that will be my biggest concern, is keeping the lakes clean and protected. So shoreline violations are something that we always want you to call about.
And I do mirror what Erica stated. Again, we do take anonymous complaints. But if you do call us, again, we have a very good ability to take a look at our GIS system to see whether or not we've even issued permits for that property. So again, if you call us, we can talk with you. You can remain anonymous. And then we try to go out on those complaints as priority allows us. Some of the shoreline grading violations, we're out there ASAP. Some other zoning type of violations like junkyards, dilapidated structures, may take us a little bit longer to get out to. But if you see it, call us. I mean, we deal with a multitude of different type of violations. Sometimes they are, but most of the times the anonymous complaints are legitimate, so we do go out there and investigate those.
We have a lady here.
I still want to hear maybe from the law enforcement or the
Yeah. So
credentialed law enforcement people with firearms.
Violations, obviously, when they're occurring, no different than I guess calling 911 in an emergency. If you have a non-emergent line, that works as well. But if it's happening and we can get out there while it's happening, it's easier for us to do our job per se. After the fact, we're going to rely on witness statements, pictures if there are any, and then try to see what that suspected violator has to say, and if we're going to get the full honest story or not, or probably not, and then have to go off of that. So when something's occurring is a good time to call us. We have people on obviously 24/7. Unlike the DNR, maybe they're not working all the time, which is fine. They have their own hours that they work. But as a sheriff's department, someone's on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365, unless it's a leap year, 366. But call us and we can head out there, or we can have someone head out there and hopefully get it mitigated before it turns into something more.
Michael, a quick variation on that. We had the question about fishing tournaments. Do people ever call you ahead of time to say, hey, we know there's going to be a lot of out-of-county people at this landing on this date. Can somebody be there ahead of time? Is that a worthwhile call or not?
That's a perfect call for the DNR.
No. So my rule of thumb is call, as Michael stated, call when it's happening. The sooner you call, the better. Call frequently, call often, call whenever there's a violation. We, the DNR, we do have a complaint tracking system that we use to track the numbers, track the locations, the types, all that stuff, and we have become a very data-driven agency, so we use that stuff, you know, in the world of mapping programs and stuff. We can look and see where most of our complaints are geographically, time of year, etc., and we are beginning to use that stuff to allocate our resources, including staffing. So even if we're not able to actually physically respond to some of these complaints, it starts to create a record for our agency to know that this is where it's occurring. You know, the Northwoods, we've never been a particularly population dense area, but yet somehow, you know, today when we go look at Highway 51 or Highway 45, there's way more traffic going north than going south today, right? So it helps us kind of say, you know, to get back to the point about registered boats with Darren, that, you know, most of the boats that are registered in Wisconsin are probably in the metro areas, but there's an awful lot of trailers heading north today. So by having those complaints and showing that, no, the violations are not occurring, I mean, they are occurring in Green Bay, but some of those Green Bay registered boats, believe it or not, are making their way to Vilas and Oneida counties where they're creating conflicts. So it gives us an idea on where these violations are occurring. Along with that, what I would say is, you know, again, kind of the caveat is call frequently, call often, call when they're happening, but I also have to admit, temper your expectations for any given call, because we are triaging these calls to the best of our ability. You know, sometimes, you know, again, like today, apparently I'm the only one available for Oneida and Vilas County, and I don't really feel particularly available right now. But so I'm probably not going to respond to the Land O'Lakes area for a jet ski complaint that's occurring right now, because I'm going to drive past 5 or 6 lakes that I've had complaints on in the past. So I'm going to have to kind of triage and make the best use of my time. I'm not doing boating enforcement while I'm driving down the highway. So we are constantly triaging our stuff and trying to make, you know, use trendy terms, real-time decisions on how to spend our time.
One last, let's skip Darren and then we'll go to the question.
You know, just with the unique nature of this group, and to get back to the question on when to call, from my chair, and I deal a lot with creation of local boating ordinances or waterway marker applications and permit processing. So my recommendation, if there's lake associations, local units of government, sanitary districts represented in this room, and you're looking at doing some permitting, some buoys, some buoy replacements, some local boating ordinances for one thing or another, I would recommend getting a hold of me or the local recreation warden for your area, and I can get you all that information offline before you start putting pen to paper. Get a hold of us and let us know what you're thinking before you start going too far into the weeds. One, you may be recreating the wheel. I may know something that happened in a different part of the state that you can just plagiarize, which is generally fine. And then two, you may be going a direction that probably isn't the right direction for what you want to accomplish based on, I'm not going to call myself a dinosaur, but 25 plus years as a warden. I may have some information to share before you get too far into the weeds on something. So from my chair, ordinances, permits, get a hold of me or the recreation warden before you start getting too far into it.
Great advice. Okay, we had a question back here in the...
Back to the AIS violation. I'm hearing that it's just not a real high priority, but I guess my big question then is should we report these to the DNR and the sheriff, or it sounds like the DNR will track it if we use the tip line, but we may not necessarily get any information back from them, or should we report this to the local sheriff instead? What's our best option?
I guess from my perspective, a best option might be both. If you called into our local tip line, I don't want to portray that for us. We work for the Department of Natural Resources, so AIS is a big deal to us. When I see a trailer going down the road with a big old salad on its axle, that's a big deal to me. Now, I can't convince, and I work in Green Bay, one of, bigger metro area where I've got I think 16 different assistant DAs and like 12 judges. Now to say that that's gonna take a high priority for them, I can't do that. But from our chair, that is a priority because we know the importance of it. But if you report it to me, or report it to the DNR hotline, that gets a warden going, or at least on their screen. Same thing with the sheriff's office. If it gets on their screen, you know, if there's somebody available, they'll go. If they can't, they can't. And I think everyone would understand if there's a violent felony going on, somebody's physically getting injured or hurt, that's got to take priority over weeds on the trailer. But it doesn't discount the fact that it is important, and I would do both. But I'll pass that on to the sheriff's office.
Yeah, again, it is a big deal. Again, our prosecutors are the ones that follow up on that or whenever we write those citations, but we'll stop it. We'll make them pull their own weeds off. If we issue that ticket, that's fine. That's something we can see. We're there, they did it, they were transporting it. So it is, we want to know that because we don't want our lakes getting messed up. You guys don't want your lakes getting messed up with milfoil or whatever it might be, right? It is a big deal. So call us. If you call it into the tip line, call your sheriff's department. At least in Oneida, we handle a lot of those complaints, and we don't mind doing it because we want water to use too on our free time off.
Do you issue warnings? Also, it sounds like, follow-up on citations is pretty tough or not going to happen. What about warnings?
Yeah, can I give another version of that too? Because there's a question I have is, does every citation have to turn into a court case, or some people just pay the citation and deal with it?
Yeah. So some people pay it, deal with it, and they move on. Life's good. Sometimes, depending on the severity of it, it might just warrant that warning from us. The beautiful thing we have is discretion. And a lot of it depends on, to be frank, people's demeanor. If they're not going to take it serious and they're blowing it off and they're like, why are you stopping me? Why are you doing this? This isn't a big deal. Well, it is because we've all seen the effects it has. I've seen it on the lake I used to grow up on up here. So demeanor plays a lot into it too, whether people get a ticket or a warning. So.
Got a question on this side. Front.
Hi, I'm Nancy with the Moan Lake Chain Association here in Oneida County, and there's a lot of concerns and about wake boats, not only from our chain, but a lot of lakes in the North Woods. And I'm wondering, maybe Darren, you can speak to what's happening statewide, or what kind of legislature, what's happening to regulate that.
So, since last December, and a little background for those of you that don't know this, but since last December I gave a presentation at the Natural Resources Board reference wake surfing and the use of ballast boats, dealing with current Wisconsin statutes that specifically apply to that activity. Since then, it's pretty much a daily conversation I have with somebody about wake surfing, and it's probably more than any reason why I'm sitting up here today was anticipating that question, or a similar question, because you can't have a lake conversation and not talk wake surfing. So the basic gist of it is that the rules that we currently have on the books deal with some speed regulations, deal with some distances from shore. We definitely have some aquatic invasive laws that can be applied, but nothing that we currently have in the books deals uniquely with wake surfing and the use of ballast boats. In some states in the country, especially in the northeast part of the country, the DNR basically draws up the law and the governor signs off on it because it has to do with natural resources. That's not the way Wisconsin works. So Wisconsin, the laws, if they're going to be changed or created, go through the legislative process. They go through, the local elected officials, which we talked about this morning on budgeting, the same people, and they draft the bills go through committee, blah, 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 and governor may or may not sign off on them at the end. So for at least the last, what would you say, maybe 2-3 years, it's been more active on trying to get state legislation passed, reference the use of ballast boats and the technology that they're in. I personally have had conversation with legislators from the Assembly on this issue. I actually just typed up a legislative response to another one yesterday. But to date, I am not aware of any legislation that's been drafted. I certainly have not been subpoenaed to testify or called to testify in front of committee or any legislative group. That doesn't mean that it's not moving. I mean, the legislator and the DNR, we try to be in conjunction, but it's two different branches of government. I don't report to them, they don't report to me. So I can't say with any sort of certainty that there aren't legislators typing at their desk right now drafting legislation. What I can tell you is at this point in time, I have not been called to testify, and being the spokesperson for the DNR on wake surfing and ballast boats, I suspect I would be called to give an opinion or at least type something out. So I think, and this is merely speculation to get to specifically to your question, at this point in time, I think I'm safe to say that the legislator is contemplating which direction they want to go. Are we going to take some action or aren't we? And they're milling it over. With having some conversations and some Teams calls and different means of communication to different legislators individually and in a couple of groups, I think there's some conversation being had at the Capitol. I'm not just involved in those conversations yet.
There's laws that can be enforced about disturbing the lake bottom for excavating and things, but that's kind of what they're doing with the wake boats as well, is they're disturbing the lake bottom.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are both state and local and county ordinances, rules that deal with dredging or excavating in navigable waterways, no doubt about it. But those rules don't apply to the bottom scouring that occurs through boating activities. So while one could make an argument, and there's definitely pictures and videos out there of here's the rudder line or here's the the prop wash of going through, those dredging rules, there's no way we're going to get dredging rules to apply to boating. Now, with that being said, and quite frankly, I'm very optimistic about reading this report. I'm very curious. I want to see this report. The University of Minnesota is releasing their Phase 2 report either late summer or early fall, which is going to specifically deal with bottom scouring of recreational boating activities, including the use of ballast boats. So that, as far as I know, will be the first research that actually looks into what are wake surfing boats or ballast boats or other recreational boating activities actually doing to our beds of our navigable waters. We've had some data, we have some research, we have anecdotal data, but this is the first time that we're going to actually have a university put on paper and say, this is what's happening, for no other reason but to provide decision makers with facts. And like I said, that's coming out, or scheduled to come out late summer, early fall, and I think that may be a game changer is if we can see scientific data and be able to say, here's a report that specifically outlines this is what happens at X depth by this activity. May it just get me, maybe no one wants to read it. I want to read it. I'm sure that, we've been on the stage how many times together. You want to read it.
You can buy tour T-shirts for during
yeah.
on our Wakeboat tour.
Yeah, we've had a couple conversations about it. So did I get to your question?
Yeah, I guess, what do we do then? Nothing?
Contact your legislators. The one thing I can tell you is if you want laws changed or added, contact let them know that you as an individual, you as a voter, you as a taxpayer, you as a resident of the state of Wisconsin, you as a lake association, you as a lake association member, you as a local unit of government representing the North Woods want something done. They work, they work for you. We all basically work for the public. We're all in public service, but these are your elected officials. Let them know what you think. And, get a hold of the Senate, get a hold of the assemblyman. I'm sure, I know there's people in here that have that contact information for whatever county you're from, and they'll give it to you. Otherwise, you can search a Wisconsin legislator on the computer and it'll show all that information. But I would say, if you feel strongly, one way or another, when it comes to use of ballast boats or any legal issue, contact your lawmakers. They don't know what their constituents are thinking if you don't share that with them. Share it. And that's the best information I can do, because the only way we're going to get laws changed is through legislation. And your legislators need to know what their constituents are thinking. So get a hold of them. And I think, and I don't know if there's any legislators in the room, but I would think as an individual is great, because they work for you. But if you had a group that felt the same way, whether it's a lake association or sanitary district or an environmental type group or something, whatever group, I think a group might have more clout than an individual, or both. I would say do both.
I would say too, on behalf of Wisconsin Lakes, and we work on this issue quite a lot. We did a day and a half of programming on recreational impact issues at the Lakes Convention, and probably will do so again next April. One of the issues that I have had with state level legislation is Wisconsin and probably Minnesota, Michigan, these sort of northern tier Great Lakes states with a lot of lakes. It's really hard to craft the best possible legislation that you would want that will go very far to solve the problems, because each lake's issue is so independent of one another based on size and shape and depth. And anytime you go into a legislative campaign, you don't get everything you want. There are going to be compromises. The industry is certainly going to come in, and there are going to be advocates that advocate against this. I mean, we could probably get a state law that would say no enhanced wakes within 250 feet of shore and 15 feet of depth. But the science is sort of starting to show that might not be enough in terms of impacts. So one of the things that I'm weighing is when is the right time, and what is the right numbers to be looking at. Most of the places across the country where there have been successful state level actions, and there are very many, have been very targeted at very specific water bodies, or even in Vermont, where Darren was referring to, there's the Vermont DNR has an extraordinary amount of power, and so there was a citizen petition to create rules in Vermont. Even there aren't as many lakes that have to be regulated that would be in the same ways here. So what happens in Vilas County might look very much different from what would happen in southeastern Wisconsin. We have to somehow account for that. So for that and a whole other number of reasons that are more political and strategic, we, Wisconsin Lakes, have come to the conclusion that right now, 2023, is not the time to start a statewide campaign. Maybe it's coming soon, but we're waiting to see what happens with some of the local efforts that have gone on, and some other things are happening. I'll end with maybe one potential place that we're thinking about, that I'm thinking about at least, is the issue that the ballast tanks on these boats are very, very hard, if not completely impossible, to fully clean, and so they can carry those zebra mussel veligers and other invasives. And so it's technically not a violation of state law to be driving with them, because you can't. There's no way to be able to get that stuff out. But should the legislature look at that in terms of AIS transport, we'll ignore all the issues with enforcement and whether people would actually get prosecuted for things like that. But for now, but that is something that we're talking about. So.
Eric, can we take one more question here?
We have time for probably just one more question, Joe.
Hi, my name is Dick Garrett, and I live on the Minocqua-Coaga part of the chain, and I've been on their board for like 26 years. As I drive around the lake, I see areas where there are 10, 15 boats shoulder to shoulder around the island or near the condos. Boats are proliferating, and I run into people that say, I have a boat slip that I rent on Lake Minocqua. what's the legal aspect of that? I mean, I'm allowed like 2 boats on my 100 feet, and we're multiplying the boat traffic tremendously with all of these condos and things that go in. So somebody comment on that, please.
Carl? It's below the ordinary high water mark, but there is a rule about how many slips and associated with development, right?
Yes, and all I can state is talk to the Department of Natural Resources. I mean, and I say that Oneida County did regulate piers and berth structures at one time, and it was found to be not in compliance with state law, so Oneida County no longer regulates. But since that time, I have seen a proliferation of piers and boats, and it is a very lucrative business, especially on the Monaco chain.
So is it going to stop?
Stop.
Well, every year I see more and more areas with more and more boats. Is it legal or illegal?
We do regulate the pier aspect of things. Quite honestly, I'm hardly the pier installation expert. You know, we used to have a pier planner that we put out as a recommendation. I think we had to do away with that. I think the legislature decided they were going to enact their own laws. And as far as I know, in the last 10 years or better, the laws have certainly been relaxed. And, you know, as far as like the number of boats on a body of water, again, it kind of comes back to it is part of the public domain. We don't regulate the number of boats on a body of water, and I you know, by the state constitution, I don't think there's even an avenue.
Well, I'm not asking for that, because in the weekends we get a huge number of boats. It's parking those boats that I'm concerned about, and leaving them there permanently.
And I understand that, but by and large, you know, and I'm hardly the pier expert. I cannot even begin to recite what our current laws are. If Darren's any better, doesn't look like it. That's not entirely my wheelhouse, you know, of a
They appear to be a lot different than the rules that I have to follow in front of my house. That's something way different there. Thank you, though.
I think you've hit on a huge issue that we're looking at. That sort of, it's the wake boat piece of this, and that is capacity on lakes. As the boats have gotten bigger and we've gotten more boats, there's more pressure to put them on the water. If my friend Jake Schmidt from Geneva Lake Environmental Agency was here, he would be telling you about the facility that's just off the lake that is a big barn that has like 5 stacks of boats that on a weekend they'll bring the guys that run it, bring the forklifts, bring the boats down to their private landing, and you have, you know, so they've avoided the pier problem by just keeping the boats off land completely. And we as a state we haven't grappled with this problem yet, so there is no fast answer to that, because it does play into constitutional protections to right to use our waters through the public trust doctrine, but it's something that we have to start dealing with now. And, you know, as I said, the wake boats, piers, and all of these things are just a little piece of that. So it's something that as an organization we're aware of and we're certainly thinking about. But I don't have any good, strong answers how to solve the problem this summer.
All right.
And just have one thing on the piers. You can go out with your pier until you hit 36 inches of water, and it can be 6 feet wide. And if you're handicapped, you can get a handicap permit to go 8 feet wide. So.
Okay. We have run out of time, of course, and I want to give a moment to thank our panelists here today. I also thank the presenters that were with us this morning, and I want to thank all of you again for giving your time on this Friday morning and into the afternoon to spend working on protecting these lakes in partnership. I really do appreciate it. I know, is there a slide for the, yep, here's the slide for the meetings that follow immediately afterward. So if you want to stick around and strengthen your countywide groups, we certainly would encourage you to do that. Otherwise, thank you all for a tremendous morning.